Hello there and welcome to Physics with William, where curiosity gets comfortable and science is allowed to slow down for a while. Tonight we're settling in with a question that has tempted inventors, annoyed physicists, and kept an astonishing number of wheels, gears, magnets and hopeful sketches in circulation for far longer than any of them managed to spin on their own. Our subject is perpetual motion, that lovely and stubborn dream of a machine that starts once and simply never stops. A device that keeps turning, keeps working, keeps giving, and never once asks for more fuel, more winding, more pushing, or more patience. It is the sort of idea that arrives very quietly and then refuses to leave. You see a top spinning on a table, you watch a ceiling fan coast for a few seconds after the power is off. You notice how the moon keeps going around the Earth, how the Earth keeps turning, how a child can stare at a pinwheel in the wind and wonder whether the universe might have hidden somewhere a little secret for making motion last forever. And perhaps that is why this topic has such staying power. It does not begin in a laboratory. It begins in a very human place. It begins with the feeling that movement seems so natural, so ordinary, so constant, that perhaps there ought to be a way to keep it going forever, if only one were clever enough. Before we get too far into that pleasant trap, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from, and perhaps what time it is where you are right now. There is something fitting about that. A conversation about endless motion, arriving at different hours in different rooms for different people, each of us borrowing a little time together while the planet quietly continues its own vast and rather reliable rotation beneath us. And if this kind of slow scientific wandering is your sort of thing, if you enjoy these calm little expeditions into the strange corners of physics, I would be very grateful if you liked the video and subscribed. It helps this quiet corner of the internet reach more people who may also want a softer way into big ideas. My only concern, as always, is that the subject may be just interesting enough to keep you awake. Though if that happens, at least you will be awake for a respectable reason, and not because you have decided for the fourth time tonight to look up whether octopuses dream. Now, perpetual motion sounds, at first, almost innocent. It sounds like a tidy engineering challenge, like something that should eventually yield to persistence and a better workshop. After all, much of engineering is just that. We improve bearings, we reduce drag, we choose better materials, we sharpen blades, polish surfaces, cool engines, balance rotors, and generally try to persuade matter to behave itself for a bit longer than it wanted to. So when someone says they want to build a machine that runs forever, part of the brain does not recoil. Part of it nods. Yes, quite ambitious, it thinks, but perhaps not absurd. Perhaps the trick has simply not been found yet. That hopeful part of the mind has had a very long career. For centuries, people have sketched wheels with moving weights, each weight arranged so that one side of the wheel would always be just a little heavier than the other. That way, the wheel would forever tip itself forward, always falling, always gaining another little push from gravity. Others imagined gears that would feed themselves, pumps that would lift the very water that drove them, pendulums that would never lose their swing, magnets that would somehow pull forever without ever needing to pay back what they had borrowed. The details changed. The optimism did not. One can picture the scene in almost any era. A workbench lit by candle or lamp, a half-assembled contraption, a person leaning over it with the quiet conviction that everyone else has missed something simple. And to be fair, it is hard not to sympathise. There is something wonderfully economical about the dream. A machine that powers itself feels like the final victory over waste, over dependence, over the long list of things that need topping up, charging, refilling, repairing, replacing, or apologising to. We live in a world where nearly everything useful comes with a cost. Lamps want electricity, cars want fuel, bodies want sleep, homes want heating. Even your most loyal kitchen appliance will eventually begin to make a noise that means trouble. The idea of a device that simply carries on forever has the same charm as the idea of a garden that weeds itself, or a sock drawer that organises its own contents. It appeals not only to our intellect, but to our deep and private desire to be spared inconvenience. That dream becomes even more seductive when one notices that nature already seems full of persistent motion. The Earth spins, the planets orbit, ocean currents move, winds circle. Electrons, at least in the loose way we speak about them, do not appear to get tired and sit down for a little rest. A child can be forgiven for wondering why a machine cannot simply join the general activity. Everything else seems so busy. Why should a wheel not also find its place in the great dance and keep to it? But the moment we ask the question carefully, the ground begins to shift a little under our feet. Because there are at least two different dreams hidden inside the phrase perpetual motion. The first is a machine that keeps moving forever once started. The second, and much more ambitious, is a machine that not only keeps moving forever, but also does useful work forever, without any new energy coming in. That second dream is the one people usually mean, whether they say so plainly or not. A wheel that spins forever in deep empty space and does nothing is interesting in a limited sort of way. A wheel that spins forever while grinding grain, lifting water, charging batteries, heating homes, or paying your electricity bill while you sleep is something else entirely. That would not merely be a long-lasting machine. That would be a miracle with bearings, and here the universe becomes noticeably less cooperative. It helps to start with ordinary experience. Roll a ball across the floor and it slows down. Push a child on a swing and the arc gradually shrinks if you stop pushing. Ride a bicycle downhill, then onto level ground, and sooner or later the bicycle comes to a stop, even if you are very determined and have adopted the expression of someone who intends not to be beaten by air. Rub your hands together and they grow warm. Stir tea and the motion dies away. Wind up a toy and it unwinds. Everything we touch seems to whisper the same dull but dependable message. Motion leaks. Energy spreads out. Nothing stays perfectly contained. We know the culprits by name: friction, air resistance, internal heating, imperfect materials, tiny deformations, losses so small they seem trivial in the moment, and then, through the patient arithmetic of reality, become decisive. This is one reason perpetual motion machines have always looked most plausible in the mind or on paper. Paper has magnificent bearings. Sketches do not heat up. Pencil lines do not grind against each other. A drawn wheel can be perfectly balanced forever, which is more than can be said for most of us by midweek. Still, it is worth noticing that not all motion fades quickly. A heavy flywheel can keep turning for quite some time. A well-made clock can run for days or longer on stored energy. A spacecraft can coast through space for years after its engines are off. A planet can orbit a star for billions of years. So the line between ordinary persistence and truly perpetual motion is not always obvious at first glance. Nature occasionally seems to flirt with the idea just enough to keep our hopes from settling down completely. That is part of what makes this subject so satisfying. The answer is not a lazy no. It is not physics folding its arms and refusing to explain itself. The real answer is more interesting than that. Physics says no in a very specific, layered and revealing way. It says no because the universe keeps careful books. It says no because energy does not appear from nowhere, just because a gear train is charming. It says no because even when energy is conserved, usefulness is not. And it says no because the world has a persistent habit of turning ordered motion into less useful forms, especially heat, which is excellent at appearing where it was not invited. That may sound severe, but it is also deeply informative. The impossibility of perpetual motion is not some petty rule invented to disappoint inventive people. It is one of the clearest windows we have into how reality is structured. If perpetual motion were possible in the strong sense people usually want, then some of our most reliable ideas about nature would collapse. Energy accounting would become optional. Heat would become strangely obedient. The distinction between possible and impossible machines would blur into a kind of carnival. Entire civilizations would look different. Factories, cities, transport, economics, even the ordinary shape of daily life would be transformed by devices that gave endlessly without taking anything in return. No wonder people kept trying. There is also a psychological reason the dream survives. Humans are very good at spotting patterns and very bad at feeling where hidden costs have gone. If a machine appears to run itself for a while, the mind quickly supplies a story. Perhaps the inventor has found a special arrangement. Perhaps the motion is feeding back on itself. Perhaps gravity is doing a little more than usual. Perhaps the magnet is helping. Perhaps everyone else laughed at the steam engine too. This is how hopeful machines gain followers. A few minutes of unexplained motion can feel much more persuasive than an hour of careful accounting, especially when the careful accounting involves terms like losses, dissipation, and thermal equilibrium, none of which has ever won a popularity contest. Magnets deserve a special mention here because they have lured many clever people into this maze. Magnets are wonderfully deceptive. They pull without visible strings. They feel active, almost alive. Set two magnets near each other and one may leap into motion in a way that seems to promise free help from nowhere. Surely people think there must be a clever arrangement of magnets that keeps a wheel forever off balance, forever being tugged along. Yet magnets are not little fountains of endless energy. They can store energy and exchange it, but they do not provide a permanent loophole. The trouble with every magnetic perpetual motion design is that what helps on one part of the path hinders on another. The pushback arrives, the balance closes, and the miracle goes home disappointed. Gravity plays a similar trick on the imagination. Since things fall all the time, it is tempting to picture gravity as a permanent source of motion. But gravity is more like a slope than a fuel tank. It can guide motion. It can convert stored energy into movement. It can help things fall, swing, orbit, or roll. What it does not do is endlessly refill what has already been spent. If a weight falls once, you must lift it again somehow if you want the process repeated. That lifting costs you. Gravity is not stingy exactly, but it is not forgetful either. And yet, despite all these disappointments, the question remains beautifully alive because the edge cases are fascinating. What about motion in nearly frictionless systems? What about superconductors? What about superfluids? What about objects in space? What about quantum effects? What about the universe itself? If we are careful, could there be something that looks enough like perpetual motion to force a rethink? Could nature contain processes that continue indefinitely, without the sort of losses we're used to seeing in daily life? Could there be machines that do not violate the deep rules, but come close enough to the dream to feel uncanny? Those are good questions. They are the right kind of questions. The kind that turn a flat no into an interesting investigation. Because the history of perpetual motion is not only a history of failure, it is also a history of physics learning how to say no more precisely. People tried to build impossible machines long before the laws explaining their impossibility were fully understood. In that sense, the dream was productive. It irritated science into sharpening itself. It forced clearer thinking about work, heat, energy, efficiency, and irreversibility. Whole branches of thermodynamics grew up, in part around the need to explain why the impossible machine stayed impossible. That is one of my favourite things about science. Bad ideas are not always useless ideas. Sometimes a bad idea is so persistent, so tempting, so difficult to kill in a satisfying way, that it ends up teaching us more than a dozen modestly good ideas ever could. Perpetual motion belongs to that category. It is wrong in a fruitful way. It makes us ask what motion really costs, what energy really is, what heat really does, and why the universe allows some forms of order to persist while quietly eroding others. If you look at the dream from a different angle, it is not really about machinery at all. It is about whether reality permits a free lunch. It is about whether one can get useful order without paying for it somewhere. And the answer physics keeps giving again and again is subtle but firm. You may borrow, you may store, you may convert, you may delay losses, reduce them, move them, disguise them, and become extremely sophisticated in your methods. What you may not do is erase them by optimism. That sober conclusion might sound like the end of the story, but in truth it is where the story begins to get interesting. Once we accept that the dream keeps failing, we can ask why each version fails in its own particular way. Why does the overbalanced wheel stall? Why do magnetic designs trap themselves? Why can a perfectly smooth sketch succeed where a real device cannot? Why does reducing friction help so much and yet never enough? Why do some natural systems seem to coast almost forever, while no workshop machine manages the trick? Why do the laws of motion alone seem permissive, while the laws of heat quietly arrive later and close the door? And beyond the physics there is the human part, which I would not want to lose. There is something endearing about the eternal return of the impossible machine. Every era has its hopeful inventors, its persuasive demonstrations, its diagrams that look just plausible enough to make you lean in, its audiences split between admiration and suspicion. Even now, in an age of satellites and particle accelerators, the old dream still appears dressed in fresh language, promising to overturn everything. The costumes change. The longing does not. So let us begin where people usually begin, not with the law that says no, but with the impulse that says surely there must be a way. Long before thermodynamics grew stern and formal, long before physics had neat categories for energy and entropy, people were already staring at wheels, weights, water and magnets, with a particular look in their eyes. It is the look of someone who suspects the universe may be hiding a simple trick in plain sight. And once that suspicion takes hold, it becomes very difficult to leave the workshop and go to bed, because somewhere in the turning of a wheel there seems to be a promise, and the earliest dreamers of endless motion were more than ready to follow it. To understand why the idea of endless motion became such a powerful lure, it helps to imagine a time before physics had the neat vocabulary we use now. There was no firm language of energy conservation, no polished treatment of heat, no settled account of efficiency, and certainly no classroom warning that a machine promising more output than input belongs in the same category as miracle tonics and chairs advertised as improving posture while you sleep. There were craftsmen, natural philosophers, millers, clockmakers, miners, monks, court inventors, and practical people of every sort, all surrounded by moving things and all with good reason to care about motion. Water turned wheels, animals pulled loads, falling weights drove mechanisms, wind pushed sails and spun mills. Human life depended on getting motion where it was needed and keeping it there for as long as possible. In that world, the dream of a self-moving machine did not seem childish. It seemed useful. If you could make a wheel that turned itself, you could grind grain without a river, pump water without a horse, lift stone without exhausting a crew, and perhaps most importantly, gain a reputation as the sort of person other people suddenly listen to. That last motive should not be ignored. The history of invention has always contained a healthy amount of ambition, vanity, curiosity, desperation, and the very human wish to be the one who saw what everybody else missed. The earliest form of the dream was usually tied to gravity. Gravity is persuasive because it never takes a day off. Stones fall, water runs downhill, things swing back toward the ground with such regular loyalty that it's easy to see why people began asking whether gravity might be arranged, redirected, or tricked into doing more than it seems to do at first glance. If a weight falls and pulls a wheel, then perhaps another weight on the same wheel can be positioned so the turning continues. If one side can always be a little heavier than the other, then surely the wheel will never stop tipping forward. It sounds almost embarrassingly simple, which is one reason the idea lasted so long. Complex fraud is easier to distrust. Simple hope can survive for centuries. A very old family of designs involved the so-called overbalanced wheel. Picture a wheel with arms or compartments carrying weights. As the wheel turns, the weights on one side slide outward, while the weights on the other side stay closer to the centre. Since weights farther from the centre have more leverage, the outward side appears to gain an advantage. The result, at least in the imagination, is a constant imbalance. One side always seems ready to fall. One side always seems ready to pull the wheel around again. If you sketch it carefully enough, It can look convincing for an uncomfortable amount of time. Many people have stared at such drawings and felt the first small thrill of forbidden possibility. One can almost hear the thought forming. It cannot be that everyone before me was blind. Perhaps they simply arranged the weights badly. This was not the dream of fools alone. That is important. The temptation reached smart people because it grows from a respectable intuition. When we first encounter mechanics, we are strongly drawn to local advantages. This weight is farther out. That lever is longer. This side looks heavier. That magnet seems stronger here than there. The mind focuses on the part of the motion where the machine appears to gain, and it neglects the part where the gain must be paid back. In other words, the trouble with perpetual motion is not that it looks absurd from the beginning. The trouble is that it often looks promising in one half of the cycle. That makes it an excellent trap. Long before modern thermodynamics settled the matter, scholars in India, the Islamic world and medieval Europe all encountered versions of self-moving wheels in texts, drawings, or reported devices. Some descriptions were speculative, some were sincere attempts. Some belonged to the broad tradition of mechanical ingenuity, where clocks, automata, fountains, and lifting machines all mingled in a lively traffic of ideas. The line between practical engineering and marvellous contrivance was not always sharp. A machine could be clever, symbolic, entertaining, and allegedly useful all at once. Courts liked spectacle, patrons liked novelty, and inventors, then as now, liked to suggest that their latest device might change everything. One of the great ironies is that the same cultures which produced superb real machines also preserved endless hope for impossible ones. That is not a contradiction. It is almost what we should expect. The better you become at making water clocks, mills, gear trains, escapements, bell-striking mechanisms, and automated figures, the easier it is to imagine that one final arrangement remains undiscovered. One hidden geometry of weights and wheels that will cross the line from ingenious to inexhaustible. Success breeds confidence, and confidence occasionally wanders into fantasy wearing work boots. Medieval Europe in particular became a fertile home for the idea. Manuscripts circulated with sketches of wheels containing hinged arms, rolling masses, shifting hammers, and other arrangements meant to keep a continuous imbalance. The appeal was practical and intellectual at the same time. A successful wheel would not merely save labour. It would reveal a deep principle of nature. It would show that the world contained a secret generosity waiting to be unlocked by mechanical insight. There is something almost touching in that. Before the laws were written clearly, people were trying to negotiate directly with nature, hoping it might agree to be just a little more helpful than it usually is. One can imagine a workshop conversation from several hundred years ago and recognise it immediately. The materials are different. The tone is the same. Someone says the problem with previous designs is friction. Another says the weights need better timing. A third insists the geometry has never been understood properly. Then a sketch appears, followed by silence, followed by the sound of several people becoming much more confident than the evidence allows. Human beings have changed less than we flatter ourselves by believing. Of course, the old dream was not limited to gravity-driven wheels. Water offered its own temptations. If water can turn a wheel and a wheel can drive a pump, why not use the pump to raise the same water again and keep the system going? At first glance, this can seem almost sensible, especially if one imagines a modest lift and a very efficient wheel. But here too the machine runs into the same grim bookkeeping. The water lifted by the pump never comes back with quite enough useful energy to repay the work of lifting it, and real devices lose still more along the way. Even without a formal theory, experienced millwrights and engineers learned by hard contact with reality that water is cooperative only within limits. It will turn your wheel if you have a stream. It will not kindly climb back uphill just because your diagram needs morale. Then there were the seekers of magnetic motion. Magnets have always had a reputation for encouraging bold conclusions. A lodestone pull-in iron can feel a bit like hidden willpower inside matter. There is contact without touch, force without visible rope, action without strain. That makes magnets ideal for attracting belief in secret mechanical shortcuts. If one magnet can pull a piece of metal toward itself, perhaps a whole ring of magnets can be arranged so a wheel is always drawn forward and never held back. Countless designs have tried this, and each one runs into the same depressing but educational fact. Whatever pull helps the wheel approach, one position must be overcome when leaving another. The landscape of forces closes on itself. The bill arrives. The show ends. It is easy for us, with our modern education and our habit of speaking confidently about conservation laws, to look back and assume the answer should have been obvious. But obvious to whom? Obvious after what? A principle is only obvious once it has become part of the mental furniture. Before that, the world is a collection of examples, analogies, and unfinished intuitions. For a person living before the formal development of thermodynamics, perpetual motion was not a violation of a familiar law. It was a possibility awaiting judgment, and nature, when asked casually, does not always answer clearly. A wheel will coast, a pendulum will swing for a while, a flywheel will store motion impressively well. A carefully built mechanism may run long enough to encourage stories. In the space between appearance and explanation, hope flourishes. There is also a deeper reason the temptation was so old and so resilient. Motion itself once seemed far more mysterious than it does now. We are used to Newton, and to the idea that an object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon. But that was not always the obvious picture. In older ways of thinking, motion often seemed to require a continuing cause. Things moved because something kept moving them. When that background assumption begins to soften, a new possibility opens. Perhaps motion, once established properly, can sustain itself more than we thought. Perhaps the machine does not need constant support after all. The transition from older ideas of natural motion to more modern mechanics did not instantly kill the dream. In some ways, it gave the dream fresh oxygen. If motion can persist, then maybe a machine can be built to take advantage of that persistence, just enough to keep going forever. By the early modern period, the search had become both more sophisticated and more theatrical. Inventors presented devices to patrons and princes. Claims circulated of wheels that turned for days, of hidden principles, of rivals who failed only because they lacked the correct arrangement. Some demonstrations were surely deceptive. Hidden drives, concealed winding, selective presentation, and strategic vagueness have accompanied impossible machines with remarkable consistency. Yet not every claimant was a cynic. Many were convinced. One should never underestimate the persuasive power of a machine that almost works. A mechanism that runs for a few minutes longer than expected can take hold of the imagination with surprising force. The builder sees promise where an outsider sees delay before failure. Among the most famous figures associated with this tradition was Johann Bessler, also known as Orffyreus, in the early 18th century. He claimed to have built self-moving wheels that impressed several witnesses and attracted intense attention. Reports described large wheels turning apparently on their own for extended periods. Supporters saw genius. Critics saw fraud. The details remain tangled in performance, secrecy, personality, and missing evidence, which is exactly the sort of environment in which impossible machines prefer to live. Bessler refused to reveal the mechanism unless adequately rewarded, which did not lessen suspicion. His case became legendary not because it settled anything, but because it captures the entire atmosphere of perpetual motion history. Confidence, spectacle, hope, accusation, technical debate, a machine in a room, people staring at it longer than they intended, everyone wanting badly for the mystery to resolve in their preferred direction. By this stage, practical mechanics had advanced enormously. Clocks had become more refined. Pumps, mills, and transmission systems had grown more effective. Engineers were gaining better intuition for losses, loads, and limitations, yet the impossible machine still survived. Why? Because better engineering does not only destroy bad dreams, it can also refine them. Once an obvious design fails, the inventor simply moves to a subtler one: better bearings, better balance, less friction, more careful sequencing. The faith migrates from crude error to delicate, almost success. That is why perpetual motion remained tempting even as science matured. Each improvement in real machinery could be mistaken for proof that the final threshold was near. There is another part of the story that deserves some sympathy. The dream of endless motion emerged in a world where power was scarce, unevenly distributed, and often exhausting to obtain. A stream might be far away. Wind might be unreliable. Animal labour had costs. Human labour had more. Fuel could be expensive, dirty, or hard to transport. The promise of a machine that freed people from all of that was not merely intellectual vanity. It was a fantasy of relief. Imagine a mine owner dreaming of endless pumping, a miller dreaming of uninterrupted grinding, a city dreaming of mechanical abundance without rivers or forests being consumed. In that sense, perpetual motion belongs to the long human history of hoping for an end to scarcity. That hope has never completely gone away. It simply changes vocabulary. In one century, the impossible machine is an overbalanced wheel. In another, it is a magnetic motor. Later, it may arrive wrapped in technical language, diagrams of coils, mysterious materials, or declarations that establish science is too narrow-minded to recognize a breakthrough. The emotional structure remains familiar. Somewhere, someone feels that nature has more to give than the textbooks admit. Somewhere else, a physicist rubs their forehead and reaches again for the same patient explanation. But before that explanation became crisp, people had to learn the hard way. They had to build machines that disappointed them. They had to watch promising wheels stall at inconvenient angles. They had to discover that reducing friction helps but never saves the design. They had to notice that every clever rearrangement of weights still required those weights to be lifted somewhere else in the cycle. They had to confront piece by piece the difference between seeing motion and understanding its cost. This is where the old temptation becomes scientifically useful. Every failed wheel was, in effect, a lesson in hidden accounting. Every claim that a machine produced more than it consumed invited sharper scrutiny of where the missing contribution had been smuggled in, or where the losses had been overlooked. Slowly, a more disciplined way of thinking developed. One no longer asked merely whether the wheel could be made to turn. One asked what source drove it, where the driving influence came from, how much work was done over a full cycle, and what changes were happening that might not be obvious at a glance. That shift in attitude matters. It is the beginning of physics becoming less enchanted by appearances and more interested in balances. Even so, the older dream remained emotionally stronger than the emerging analysis for quite a while. There is nothing surprising about that. A visible wheel tugs harder on the imagination than an invisible principle. One can point to a mechanism. One cannot point to conservation with greasy fingers and say, "There, that is the problem." For a long time, the laws were less vivid than the machine. Only later would the laws become so trusted that the machine, no matter how polished, would lose its spell almost at once. Yet we should resist telling the story as though ignorance gave way cleanly to enlightenment, and that was that. The temptation persists because the basic intuition still whispers to us. If only losses were removed, if only the weights were timed better, if only the magnets were stronger, if only the vacuum were deeper, if only the bearings were perfect. Even now, with all our certainty, one can still feel the tug of the old thought experiment. What if just one design escaped the pattern? What if one arrangement of matter found a route through the maze? That quiet internal question is ancient. It links the monk sketching a wheel in a manuscript, the early modern showman guarding his workshop, and the modern internet enthusiast posting diagrams at 2 a.m. with language that becomes steadily more capitalized as confidence rises. So when we call perpetual motion the oldest temptation in physics, we do not mean only that it has been around for a long time. we mean that it touches something very basic in the way human beings think about nature. We see motion and want it to continue. We see a symmetry and expect advantage. We see a local gain and hope it survives the whole cycle. We want the world to contain a hidden bargain, a way to get more order out than we put in. The temptation is old because the mind itself is built to notice opportunities before it notices constraints. The history becomes even more interesting once the science starts catching up, because the old dream does not disappear when confronted. It becomes more defined. People begin to realize that some machines fail because they try to create work from nothing, while others fail because they cannot avoid losses and dissipation. These are related problems, but not quite the same problem. The dream starts splitting into categories, and the refusal of nature becomes more precise. That precision will matter a great deal once heat enters the story, because heat turns out to be the quiet enforcer behind much of the universe's refusal to cooperate. Before we get there, though, we need to spend a little more time with the machines themselves, because they are too revealing to skip over. Their drawings, their demonstrations, their tricks, and their almost plausible logic tell us a great deal about why intelligent people kept reaching for the impossible. The overbalance wheel in particular deserves a closer look, as do the many magnetic and mechanical versions that followed it, because these devices are not just historical curiosities. They are the recurring shapes of the temptation itself, and once you learn to see how they seduce the eye, you begin to understand why beautiful mistakes can be so durable. Let us stay with those machines for a while because they are much more revealing than they first appear. The old designs for endless motion are often dismissed with a quick smile, as if they were no more than the mechanical equivalent of trying to carry water in a sieve and then acting surprised by the result. But that is a little unfair. Many of these machines are beautiful mistakes. They are wrong in careful, intricate, almost artistic ways. Their creators were not merely daydreaming. They were studying leverage, balance, timing, gravity, attraction, momentum, and the many ways motion can seem to promise more than it ultimately delivers. If you look at the drawings with patient eyes, you can see the appeal immediately. They do not look absurd, they look almost right, which is far more dangerous. The overbalance wheel is the classic example. It appears in many forms, but the logic is usually the same. A set of weights is arranged inside or around a wheel so that, as the wheel turns, the weights shift position. On one side they move farther from the centre, and on the other side they sit closer in. Since a weight farther from the centre seems to have more turning advantage, the wheel appears to have a built-in preference. It appears to want to keep rotating in one direction. If one side is always slightly more effective than the other, then perhaps the wheel will keep falling forward forever. That little phrase is worth noticing, falling forward forever. It captures the emotional structure of the dream. The wheel is imagined not as climbing, not as spending effort, but as continually discovering a fresh downhill path. It is an elegant fantasy, and like many elegant fantasies it survives because it does not fail everywhere at once. If you freeze one of these designs at a particular angle, you can often make a persuasive argument for why it should continue turning. The problem only emerges when you follow the entire cycle with complete honesty. This is where the machines become educational. The shifting weights really do create changing torques at different positions. The geometry really does matter. The illusion is not that nothing happens. Quite a lot happens. The illusion is that the machine is gaining more on one side of the turn than it must repay on the other. Somewhere, some part of the wheel always has to lift what another part let fall. The weights that gave you leverage in one moment must be repositioned in the next, and that repositioning quietly consumes the very advantage that looked so exciting a second earlier. It is a bit like watching someone triumphantly carry groceries downhill and then forgetting that they still have to bring the empty bags back up the steps. For a moment the task looks wonderfully easy. Then the whole loop reasserts itself. Many old drawings tried to solve this by adding hinges, sliding arms, rolling balls, or swinging hammers. If a simple, overbalanced wheel failed, then perhaps the answer was not more force but better choreography. Let the weights move outward at just the right moment. let them drop through channels, let them swing on pivots, let them click into place with perfect timing. The hope was always that timing would rescue geometry, that some hidden sequence would give one side of the wheel a lasting lead. There is something very recognizable in that hope. When a design fails, it is comforting to blame the sequence rather than the principle. One says the concept is sound, only the implementation is off by a little. With a few more refinements, surely the machine will reveal its secret. This is one reason perpetual motion devices multiply so easily. Every failed design gives birth to a slightly more elaborate child. The wheel did not work because the weights jammed. The next one will have freer movement. That one did not work because the transfer happened too early. The next one will delay the shift. Another failed because the masses were too light, or the pivots too stiff, or the frame too rough, or the angle not quite correct. In this way, the impossible machine protects itself. It always seems to fail for local reasons, even when the deeper reason lies elsewhere. That pattern is not limited to wheels. It appears again and again in designs involving pendulums. Pendulums are persuasive because they have dignity. They swing with such regular calm that it is easy to imagine they possess some native loyalty to motion itself. If only one could capture that swing and feed it back into a mechanism without loss, then perhaps the motion could sustain itself. Clocks come tantalizingly close to this dream. A pendulum clock seems almost magical at first glance. The pendulum keeps going, the hands keep turning, the whole device speaks with confidence, and only later does one remember that the clock is quietly spending stored energy all the while. The pendulum is not free. It is being nudged, again and again, by a weight or spring whose account is steadily running down. Still, the visual language of the pendulum is deeply seductive. It seems modest, graceful, restrained. It does not roar or burn or throw sparks. It merely continues. And any motion that continues for a long time begins to look suspiciously self-sufficient to the hopeful observer. That is one of the recurring psychological themes in this story. Humans are very vulnerable to sustained appearance. If a device keeps moving longer than expected, it begins to feel independent, even when it is only slowly revealing the size of the battery hidden in its own past. Then there are the machines that rely on rolling balls inside curved tracks, spirals, or compartments. These are especially charming because they look so intuitive. A ball rolls down. Another ball moves into place. The wheel shifts, the pattern repeats. It can seem obvious that gravity is doing the work and that the arrangement merely harvests what gravity freely offers. But gravity is not an endless gift. It is a path through a field, not a standing order for free labour. Every descent must be balanced by a rise somewhere else in the cycle if the same masses are to participate again. The moment you insist on a loop, the accounting returns. Sometimes the drawings become almost baroque in their complexity. Multiple wheels coupled together, weights transferring between arms, ratchets allowing motion one way, but supposedly preventing its cost from appearing the other way. Internal channels guiding masses to where they are needed. At this point, the machine begins to resemble a castle built to defend a mistaken idea. Every turret has a purpose. Every gate answers a previous criticism. Yet the structure remains loyal to the same impossible dream. Complexity does not create free work. It merely gives hope more places to hide. The magnetic designs deserve their own long look because they are perhaps the most visually persuasive of all. A magnet exerts force without visible contact. That alone gives it an aura of mystery that gears and weights do not enjoy. There is no rope, no steam, no falling mass, no obvious reservoir being spent. A magnet appears to act at a distance with a kind of silent confidence, as if matter itself has opinions. Place iron near a magnet and motion begins seemingly from nowhere. It is easy to see why countless inventors thought they had found the loophole. Most magnetic perpetual motion designs take one of two broad forms. In one form, magnets are arranged around a wheel so that the rotor is always attracted toward the next position. In the other, carefully placed shields, Angles or asymmetries are supposed to allow the magnetic pull to help during one part of the rotation, while somehow avoiding the corresponding resistance during another. In both cases, the machine lives on the belief that magnetic forces can be made one-sided in a cycle that is actually closed. The trap is subtle. A magnetic field can certainly accelerate an object. It can pull a rotor into motion. It can store energy in the arrangement of objects and then release that energy as they move. But once the rotor reaches the region where the magnetic attraction helped, the same geometry that created the pull must be dealt with again as the object moves away or approaches another magnet. The apparent gift is part of a larger pattern. You do not get the attractive part without also inheriting the landscape that makes the full journey self-balancing. If that sounds abstract, it may help to think in simpler terms. A marble can roll into a valley and gain speed. It looks like a gain because it is one. But if you want the marble to return to its starting arrangement in a closed track, it must eventually climb again. The valley was never free energy, it was a rearrangement. Magnetic fields behave in a comparable way. They can guide and exchange energy within a system, but they do not hand out endless surpluses simply because the forces are invisible. Yet magnet machines remain strangely durable in the popular imagination. Part of that is emotional. Magnets seem modern even when they're ancient. They feel like the sort of thing that ought to unlock hidden efficiencies. They also make a good performance. A wheel pulled by magnets looks purposeful, almost eager. If the device turns for a moment under their influence, the demonstration can be far more persuasive than a page of analysis. For that reason, magnetic motors have enjoyed repeated revivals. They reappear in workshops, garages, patent sketches, online forums and late-night videos with titles that tend to become more confident the less closely the device is examined. Another family of beautiful mistakes involves buoyancy. These designs imagine floating bodies being used to lift part of a mechanism, which then somehow powers the process that resets the floating bodies. Water and air have always encouraged hopeful thinking because they seem gentle and abundant. If something naturally rises in a fluid, perhaps that rise can be exploited forever. One can imagine chambers filling and emptying, floats lifting arms, valves opening and closing, a whole aquatic ballet of mechanical thrift. But here again the loop is fatal, because to reset the cycle, the system must recreate the very conditions that gave the lift in the first place, and that recreation demands at least as much as was gained, with losses added for realism and insult. There is a broader lesson here. Most perpetual motion designs are not absurd because they use force. They're absurd because they forget cycles. A local process may be perfectly real. A weight may fall, a spring may unwind, a magnet may pull, a float may rise, a wheel may turn. The fraud, when there is fraud, or the self-deception when there is not, lies in acting as though these local events can be chained into a loop without paying the return costs. The eye loves the downhill segment. Physics insists on the whole route. This is why the machines are beautiful mistakes rather than random nonsense. They are built around real phenomena. Levers do multiply effect. Momentum does carry motion onward. Bearings really can reduce friction. Magnets really can pull. Pendulums really can store and exchange energy in elegant ways. None of that is false. What is false is the inference that a sufficiently clever arrangement of such truths must eventually produce an inexhaustible result. Nature is not obliged to honour every hopeful composition of its pieces. Some designs are clever enough to run for a surprisingly long time before stopping. That fact has done a great deal of cultural damage. A well-made wheel with low friction can coast. A balanced rotor can seem almost eerily persistent. A device with a hidden input can be made deeply convincing. A machine that is wound discreetly, driven externally or filmed selectively, can create stories that travel much farther than the truth. By the time someone discovers the hidden source, the legend has usually done a lap of its own. But even without fraud, honest builders can be misled by transient success. A machine may move on its own for a short while, because it was started with stored energy in positions, tensions, or raised masses that were not fully appreciated. It may appear to settle into a pattern when it is actually unwinding toward rest. This is especially common in systems with many moving parts, where the initial arrangement contains more usable energy than the builder realizes. The device feels self-starting because its beginning was never fully counted. The same sort of misunderstanding appears in modern versions of the old dream, except now the language is often more technical. Instead of overbalanced wheels and hidden weights, one hears about resonance, field asymmetry, nonlinear feedback, inertial rectification, exotic materials, or zero-point extraction. Sometimes the vocabulary is used sincerely by people who have stumbled into confusion. Sometimes it is used strategically because unfamiliar words give old mistakes a fresh coat of authority. But the pattern remains recognizable. A local effect is observed. An appealing asymmetry is noted. A full cycle is not honestly accounted for. The machine is declared revolutionary. Experienced physicists reach for tea. There is also a social reason these mistakes persist. A beautiful wrong idea is harder to abandon than an ugly one. If a machine looks elegant, if it has polished wheels, symmetrical arms, brass fittings, quiet bearings, or a compelling animation, people become invested in its promise. The design does not merely claim to work, it asks to be admired, and admiration has a way of softening skepticism. One begins to want the universe to reward the effort. Surely something this graceful should not fail for such mundane reasons as energy conservation and losses. Surely the laws of nature can make an exception for craftsmanship. Sadly, the laws remain unmoved by aesthetics. A polished impossibility is still impossible. Even so, these machines deserve respect as windows into the mechanics of misunderstanding. They show how the mind handles forces and motion before discipline arrives. We notice imbalance more readily than compensation. We notice gain more readily than repayment. We're attracted to asymmetry because it feels like opportunity. A wheel that looks heavier on one side seems to contain a narrative already. That side will fall. The other side will rise. The process will repeat. The story is so simple that it is hard not to believe it before analysis has had time to sit down. If you have ever looked at one of these designs and felt a little uncertainty, that is not a failure of intelligence. It is exactly the response that made them historically powerful. They are built to appeal to intuitive mechanics, to the version of physics that lives in quick visual judgment. Formal physics begins when we become suspicious of what quick visual judgment wants to tell us. We stop asking only what looks favoured at one instant, and start asking what happens over a complete return to the original arrangement. That change in posture is everything, and there is one more reason to linger with these devices. They reveal that the impossibility of perpetual motion is not merely about bad workshop practice. It is not just that the bearings were rough, the magnets misplaced, or the timing poor. Those practical imperfections matter, of course, and they ruin machines quickly. But even in the idealized versions, the hoped for surplus does not appear. The deeper wall is already there. Real-world losses only make the refusal louder. That point matters because it leads us out of the age of ingenious contraptions and into the age of principles. Once enough beautiful mistakes have been drawn, built, defended and dismantled, the question changes. We stop asking which arrangement of weights and magnets might finally win, and we begin asking what sort of rule the universe is enforcing that all these arrangements keep colliding with. Why does every wheel that seems favoured at one angle lose that favour over the full turn? Why does every apparent gift of force arrive as part of a larger balance? Why does every machine that promises more work than it receives end up smuggling in hidden inputs or collapsing into disappointment? And once that question is asked seriously, the first great wall comes into view. It is a wall so basic that modern physics can state it in plain language. You do not get more useful energy out of a closed system than was put in. No clever wheel, no timed magnet, no rolling mass, no polished brass contraption escapes that accounting. which means that before heat, friction, and entropy even begin their quiet sabotage, a simpler refusal is already waiting for us, and it is from there that the whole argument starts to harden. That harder wall is the one we have to face now, because before friction starts spoiling the performance, and before heat begins quietly collecting its share, there is a more basic problem standing in the doorway. A machine cannot give you more useful energy than it receives. That statement may sound plain to the point of being disappointing, but it is one of the firmest lessons physics has ever learned. It is not a fussy technicality. It is the reason the dream of a self-powering machine begins to fail even in the cleanest and most generous versions of the idea. This is the first wall, not the problem of rough bearings, not the problem of leaking seals, not the problem of poor craftsmanship or badly chosen materials. Those are ordinary problems, and inventors are right to think they can be improved. The deeper wall is that motion and work are not created by clever arrangement alone. A gear train can redirect effort, a lever can trade distance for force, a spring can store energy and release it later, a wheel can smooth out motion, a magnet can pull, gravity can guide a fall. But none of these things manufactures a surplus from nowhere. They can move energy around, convert it, delay its use, disguise its source, or release what was stored before. What they cannot do is make more useful energy appear just because the device looks persuasive on a workbench. This is where many perpetual motion proposals go wrong in a very specific way. They focus on motion rather than accounting. If something turns, swings, rolls, or vibrates, the mind is easily impressed. Movement feels productive. We are built to pay attention to it. But physics asks a different question. Where did the capacity to do work come from? If a machine lifts a weight, turns a generator, pumps water, or drives a blade, something must be paying for that action. If the machine is closed, meaning nothing outside is feeding it, then every bit of useful output must come from energy already present in the system at the start. Once that store is spent, the performance ends. That is why a machine can look self-sustaining for a while, without actually being self-sustaining at all. Wind up a toy, and it marches across the floor. Compress a spring, and it snaps into action. Lift a weight, and a clock can run for hours. Charge a battery, and a motor hums pleasantly until it does not. In each case, the machine seems active and independent once it is underway, but the true story began earlier. The energy was placed there beforehand. The machine is not creating new capacity. It is drawing down a reserve. This distinction between storing and creating is absolutely central. A great many supposed breakthroughs in perpetual motion turn out to be clever storage devices mistaken for sources. A flywheel can hold rotational energy very effectively. A stretched spring can hold elastic energy. Raised water in a reservoir can later run downhill and turn turbines. Compressed air can power tools. Fuel contains chemical energy that can be released by combustion. None of this is mysterious. None of it is fraudulent by itself. These are all useful ways of saving energy for later use. The trouble begins when storage is presented as generation, when a machine that merely returns what was put in is advertised as though it had invented an extra helping for itself. That error can happen innocently. Imagine someone building an elaborate wheel with internal weights and low-friction bearings. They set it in motion, watch it turn, perhaps even attach a small load, and notice that it keeps going longer than expected. Confidence rises. The builder may begin to suspect that the internal arrangement is sustaining the motion. In reality, the machine may simply have started with more stored energy in its geometry and motion than the builder appreciated. The raised positions of weights, the initial spin, the tension in springs, the tiny displacements of parts, all of these can contribute to the early performance. The wheel is not feeding itself, it is spending itself. The reason physics insists on complete accounting is that local impressions are hopelessly unreliable. At one angle, a weight seems ready to pull a wheel forward. At one moment, a magnet gives a pleasing tug. At one stage, a fluid lifts a float. If we stare only at the helpful moment, the machine looks promising. But the machine is not a series of isolated moments, it is a loop. To repeat its action, it must return to the conditions that made the helpful moment possible. The weight that fell must somehow be repositioned. The magnetically favoured alignment must be left behind. The fluid levels must be restored. The spring must be rewound. A full cycle is the only honest unit of judgment. Once you follow the full cycle, something very stubborn appears. The machine can only return to its starting state if the gains and costs balance. If it also delivers useful output during that cycle, then the balance becomes impossible unless some outside source is contributing. In ordinary language, if the machine ends where it began but you have taken work out of it along the way, that work must have come from somewhere. If nowhere outside supplied it, then you have conjured a surplus from nothing. That is the part nature refuses. One helpful way to think about this is to compare machines with bookkeeping systems. A machine does not need to have coins dropping through it to keep accounts. The account is built into what changes and what can still be done afterward. If you lift a stone, the world is different from before in a way that can be cashed in later by letting the stone fall. If you compress a spring, you have stored an opportunity for future work. If you burn fuel, chemical possibilities are rearranged, and some of that rearrangement can drive motion. The account is real even when the mechanism is silent and elegant. A beautiful device with polished brass is still being judged by the same harsh accountant as a rusty pump in a shed. And this accountant is very difficult to charm. Consider a simple lever. It can let a small force lift a large weight, which feels almost miraculous when first encountered. Yet the miracle vanishes the moment one notices that the small force must act through a larger distance. The lever does not give you more work than you put in. It trades one kind of advantage for another. The same is true of gears. They can increase torque or speed depending on arrangement, but not both for free. Hydraulics can multiply force, but only by accepting corresponding trade-offs elsewhere. Mechanical advantage is real, but it is not a loophole. It is a way of negotiating with the same total account. This is where perpetual motion inventors often become understandably frustrated. They feel they are being told that every cleverness is somehow already expected. The wheel gives no surplus. The lever gives no surplus. The gears give no surplus. The magnets give no surplus. Gravity gives no surplus. The spring gives back only what was stored. The result can feel almost rude. One spends months drawing a magnificent machine only to discover that the universe has been issuing the same reply to everyone for centuries. Very impressive, it says, but where is the input? The word input matters because it reminds us that there is nothing wrong with machines that keep operating for a long time as long as something is actually feeding them. A windmill is not suspicious because the moving air is the source. A water wheel is not suspicious because flowing water brings energy from the sun-driven water cycle and the pull of gravity. A solar panel is not suspicious because sunlight is arriving continuously from outside. An electric motor on a power line is not suspicious because the grid is doing the hard work elsewhere. Even the Earth itself is full of ongoing motion that is not magical because it is not free in the relevant sense. The planet rotates because of the way it formed. Weather moves because of sunlight and temperature differences. Tides rise and fall because of gravitational interactions. Nature is not a collection of isolated tricks. It is a network of transfers. Once that becomes clear, a great deal of confusion falls away. The dream of perpetual motion is usually not the dream of long-lasting motion in an open system. It is the dream of endless useful output in a closed one. That is the forbidden part. If energy keeps entering from somewhere, then long operation is perfectly ordinary. A river can turn a wheel for centuries if the river keeps flowing. A spacecraft can travel for a very long time if it simply coasts. A pendulum can swing longer in a vacuum than in air. But none of these examples breaks the first wall. They either rely on energy already given at the start or continue receiving influence from outside. There is also an important difference between motion and work. A body can remain in motion without continuously consuming energy in the idealized language of mechanics. But doing useful work is another matter. The moment you ask the motion to lift something, grind something, generate electricity, or overcome resistance, you are drawing on its energy. If nothing replenishes that energy, the motion will diminish. This is why a freely moving object in space is not a perpetual motion machine in the sense people usually want. It may keep moving, but it is not an endless power plant. The moment you ask it to power your house begins billing it aggressively. That may sound obvious when stated plainly, yet it is exactly the confusion behind countless impossible machines. The inventor sees sustained motion and imagines sustained work. The two are not the same. A wheel turning with almost no load can continue for a long time. Attach a generator, a pump, or even a modest brake, and the truth appears quickly. Useful output is not decorative. It must be paid for. One of the clearest signs that a machine is violating this first wall is when the claimed output exceeds any identifiable source. If a device supposedly runs a generator, charges batteries, powers lamps, or drives mechanical loads while also claiming not to consume fuel, sunlight, falling water, stored charge, temperature differences, or any other outside contribution, then the claim is not merely surprising. It is a direct challenge to one of the most tested principles in physics. That does not make genuine breakthroughs impossible in general, but it does mean the burden of evidence becomes enormous. A machine like that would not be a slight improvement. It would overturn a vast amount of established understanding all at once. That is why scientists are not being narrow-minded when they become skeptical. They are responding proportionally to the scale of the claim. If someone says they have made a better bearing, the proper response is interest. If someone says they have improved battery chemistry, the proper response is careful investigation. If someone says they have built a closed machine that gives out more useful energy than it takes in, the proper response is extraordinary caution, because the statement threatens the accounting rules that hold together everything from engines to stars. Of course, many inventors would reply that the source is not absent, only overlooked. They may say the device draws from ambient vibration, from the magnetic field of the Earth, from gravity, from the vacuum, from temperature differences, or from some subtle effect standard analysis has missed. Sometimes these suggestions are simply wrong. Sometimes they point toward real energy sources, but sources so small that they cannot support the claimed output. This is another reason the first wall matters. It does not forbid new sources. It simply requires that sources be real, measurable, and sufficient. If a machine is drawing energy from its environment, then it is not a perpetual motion machine in the strict sense. It is an energy harvester. Those are real, useful, and often impressive, but they still obey the books. There is a practical lesson here too. Good engineering becomes better the moment it stops chasing surpluses and starts minimizing losses while respecting conservation. That is how real progress happens. We do not make engines that create extra energy. We make engines that waste less of the available source. We do not build motors that run without power. We build motors that convert power more effectively. We do not invent refrigerators that cool a room for free with the door open. We learn that this is an excellent way to produce warmth and regret. The mature path of technology is not escape from accounting. It is improved honesty about it. In a sense, the first wall is liberating once accepted. It tells us where not to waste our lives. No arrangement of weights, springs, gears, magnets, or fluids in a closed system will give endless useful output from nowhere. That does not make machinery less interesting. It makes it more intelligible. We stop looking for impossible surpluses and begin studying how energy moves, how it is stored, how it is converted, and how it is lost. The world becomes more constrained, yes, but also more understandable. And understanding, unlike some workshop claims, tends to keep working when examined closely. Still, this first wall does not yet explain everything people mean when they say perpetual motion is impossible. Even if a machine never tried to produce more useful energy than it received, there would remain a second problem: quieter, and in some ways even more universal. Suppose you were perfectly honest about the total amount of energy. Suppose you accepted that nothing extra appears. Could you at least recycle that energy forever in a form useful enough to keep doing the same job without fresh input? Could you run a process in a loop, giving back all the energy you spent, just rearranged and recovered with perfect faithfulness? It is there that the second refusal enters, and it is even less forgiving, because the universe is not content merely to keep the total books balanced. It also has opinions about the quality of what remains. And this is where the story becomes stricter, because even if we grant the most generous version of the dream and stop asking a machine to give us more total energy than it receives, there is still another obstacle waiting. It is not enough for the total amount to stay the same. The energy must remain available in a form that can keep doing the job you want. That is the second wall, and it is the one that has disappointed far more hopes than rough bearings ever did. The trouble is heat. Heat is not the villain because it destroys energy. That would almost be easier to deal with. The trouble is that heat keeps the total account intact, while quietly ruining the quality of what remains. It is the universe saying, yes, you may keep the full amount, but no, you may not keep it in the tidy, obedient form you preferred. A spinning wheel can become warmth in an axle. A falling weight can become warmth in a brake. Electricity can become warmth in a wire. Motion can become warmth in a bearing. The energy does not vanish. It simply spreads into a form that is much harder to gather back up and make useful again in the same concentrated way. This is where many people first feel that physics has become slightly unfair. After all, if the energy is still there, why can we not just collect it and start again? If a machine slows because its motion became heat, then surely the heat still belongs to the machine in some sense. Why not turn it right back into motion and continue? Why should that be forbidden if nothing has been lost from the total? That is a very reasonable question, and it leads straight into one of the deepest lessons in all of science. The answer is that energy has levels of usefulness. Not every form is equally easy to direct. Not every form is equally willing to do organized work. A spinning flywheel is orderly. A compressed spring is orderly. Raised water behind a dam is orderly. A hot axle, by contrast, is not orderly in the same way at all. Its energy is present but scattered among the tiny, jostling, disorderly motions of particles. That scattered energy is much harder to aim. If you want a very ordinary example, think of a mug of hot tea left on a table. At first it is hot and the room around it is cooler. Over time the tea cools and the room warms by a tiny amount, nothing dramatic, just a steady drift towards sameness. The energy that was concentrated in the hotter drink spreads into the surrounding air, the mug, the table, and everything else nearby. Now imagine trying to reverse that process without outside help. Imagine asking the room to kindly return all those tiny fragments of warmth, collect them back into the tea, and leave the rest of the room exactly as it was. Nothing in the total amount of energy forbids this in the crudest sense, and yet it does not happen. The warmth spreads out readily. It does not gather itself back together on request. That asymmetry is the heart of the second wall. It shows up everywhere once you start noticing it. Rub your hands together and they get warm. Nobody's surprised by that. But you do not hold warm hands near each other and expect them to begin rubbing themselves. Slide a box across the floor and it slows, with motion becoming heat in the box, the floor, and the air. Again, nobody's surprised. But a slightly warmer floor does not later organize that energy into the exact reverse motion, sending the box gliding back to where it started. When you brake a bicycle, the wheel slows and the brake pads warm. The energy is still in the world, but it has changed character. It has gone from organized motion of the whole bicycle to disorganized microscopic motion spread through materials. Getting it back in a useful form is not impossible in every sense, but getting it all back, cleanly, automatically, and with no further conditions, is exactly where nature begins refusing. This is why engines need more than just energy. They need a difference, a hot thing and a cold thing, a high place and a low place, a full tank and an empty one, a charged battery and a discharged path. Useful processes feed on contrasts. When the contrast is gone, the process is done. Heat is especially revealing because it naturally erases contrast. Hot objects warm cooler ones. Temperature differences flatten out. Once everything is at the same temperature, the remaining thermal energy may be enormous in total, but it is no longer available to do the same kind of directed work. It has become like money distributed so evenly and so thinly through an economy that no single purchase can be made without first gathering it again at some cost. That point is easy to miss because we use heat productively all the time. We burn fuel, boil water, drive turbines, run engines and heat homes. Heat is not useless. It is simply limited by the conditions under which it can be turned into organised work. A steam engine does not run on heat alone in the most general sense. It runs on a temperature difference. There must be a hotter side and a cooler side. The engine takes some of the energy flowing from hot to cold and redirects part of it into useful motion. But it never turns all of that thermal energy into work. Some must still pass on as waste heat. That is not bad engineering. It is the rule. This can feel like a second insult after the first wall. The first wall says you cannot get more total useful energy out than was put in. The second says that even if you are content with equal totals, you still cannot cycle everything back with perfect usefulness once heat and real processes are involved. Some energy becomes less available, less concentrated, less willing to line up and be helpful. Imagine a room full of bouncing balls, all moving randomly in different directions. The total motion is enormous, but because it is scrambled, it does not easily add up to a large organised movement of the whole room in one direction. That is a rough way to think about heat. At the microscopic level, particles in a warm object are moving and jostling. The energy is there, but it is spread across countless tiny motions rather than gathered into one nice cooperative push. Organised motion can become disorganised motion quite easily. The reverse is not impossible in tiny, accidental flashes, but for an entire warm room to organise its random particle motion into a turning shaft, a rolling wheel, or a rising weight all by itself is not what nature does on its own in the ordinary world. That difference between organised and disorganised forms of energy is why the dream of a perfectly recyclable machine breaks down even when energy conservation is respected. Suppose you build a wheel that turns a set of gears, drives a load, and in the process warms its bearings and surroundings. You say, no problem, the energy is still here. I will just recover the warmth and feed it back into the wheel. But now you face a severe difficulty. The warmth is spread out, and unless you have a temperature difference to exploit, it is not available in the right way. If everything has warmed together, there is no slope left for heat to flow down through an engine. The energy is still present, but it has gone flat. This is why the phrase waste heat is so revealing. It does not mean heat that has vanished. It means heat that is no longer usefully arranged for the purpose you had in mind. In power plants, car engines, refrigerators, and industrial systems, vast effort goes into managing heat because it is the usual destination of energy that can no longer be fully turned into the next desired step. Machines do not merely lose energy in some mystical sense. They send it into forms that are harder to recruit again. A good comparison is water behind a dam. When the water is high, it has obvious usefulness because it can flow downward through turbines. Once it has fallen to the lower side and the level difference is gone, the same water remains, but the opportunity has changed. You do not say the water disappeared, you say the head, the difference in level, has been spent. Heat behaves similarly. A hot reservoir and a cooler environment can drive an engine. Once that temperature difference is reduced or erased, the remaining thermal energy is still there, but the opportunity has been spent. This was a profound realization in the history of physics, because it meant that conservation alone was not enough to understand real machines. You could keep the books balanced and still fail completely to explain why a process would not run backward, or why no engine could be perfectly efficient, or why a closed machine could not simply recycle its energy forever. Something more had to be said about direction, about quality, about the tendency of useful differences to wear down. That tendency is one of the most familiar features of life, even though we rarely speak of it that way. A dropped cup shatters far more readily than shards jump back into a cup. Perfume spreads through a room far more readily than a room gathers its perfume back into the bottle. Cream stirs into coffee far more readily than coffee ejects the cream in tidy ribbons. Heat moves from hotter to cooler objects until temperatures come closer together. All of these examples are different in detail, but they share a pattern. The world moves very willingly from concentrated differences toward more spread out conditions. The reverse does not happen freely in the same relaxed everyday way. It is important not to make this sound mystical. There is no tiny official inside matter forbidding neat outcomes. The point is statistical and practical. There are vastly more ways for energy to be spread out than to be concentrated in one useful arrangement. There are vastly more microscopic states corresponding to a lukewarm mess than to a sharply organized difference. That is why spontaneous spreading is so common. It is not that the universe hates order in a moral sense. It is that dispersed arrangements are overwhelmingly easier to realize than highly arranged ones unless outside work is done to maintain or restore them. And that brings us right back to perpetual motion. A machine that hopes to run forever while doing useful work must do more than conserve total energy. It must continually restore useful differences. It must take the worn-out forms of energy that emerge from its own operation, usually heat, and return them to the concentrated, directed form needed to drive the next cycle. That is exactly where the second wall stands. You cannot completely reverse that spreading in a closed system and come out even. To gather heat back into a more useful form, you need additional conditions, additional gradients, additional machinery, and in the full accounting, additional costs. This is why no heat engine can convert all absorbed heat into work. Some of the heat must be rejected elsewhere. The engine needs a hot source and a cooler sink. It draws value from the flow between them. If you try to imagine an engine attached only to a single uniform temperature bath, the idea collapses. There is no downhill path for heat to take through the engine in a way that yields organized work. Thermal energy by itself, when evenly distributed, is like a lake with no change in height. There is plenty of water, but nothing wants to flow through your wheel. At this point, many people start wondering about perfect engineering again. Fine, they say. Real engines waste heat because they are imperfect. But what about an ideal one? What about perfectly smooth materials, perfectly controlled expansion, no friction, no leaks, no sound, no deformation, no sloppy valves, no bad design? Surely then we could get all the heat back. This is exactly the dream the second wall denies. Perfect engineering can reduce certain losses. It can bring a machine closer to the best allowed by nature. But it does not erase the need for a temperature difference, or the impossibility of turning all heat into work in a cycle with no other changes. Even the best conceivable engine still cannot give you complete recovery. The limit is not just a matter of bad craftsmanship. It is built into the structure of thermodynamic processes themselves. This matters because it means disappointment was waiting even for the most honest inventor with the finest workshop in history. Suppose someone somehow eliminated almost every familiar nuisance. Suppose the wheel ran in exquisite bearings, in a near-perfect vacuum, with ideal materials, perfect alignment, and extraordinary care. Suppose further that the machine never attempted the forbidden first trick of producing more total energy than it had. It would still face the second problem. As soon as any useful process occurred, as soon as any internal rearrangement produced warmth or erased a driving difference, the machine would drift toward a state in which the remaining energy was less available for the next turn. It could not fully close its own thermodynamic loop without paying an outside price. You can see this in the humblest domestic examples. A refrigerator moves heat from a colder interior to a warmer room, but only by consuming work from outside. It does not cool for free. An air conditioner can make one place cooler, but it warms another place more overall and needs power to run. A heat pump is wonderfully efficient in practice, yet still not magical. These devices do not violate the second wall because they are not collecting disorganized warmth and turning all of it into free organized work. They are using external work to move heat around under strict constraints. The same is true in reverse for engines. A car engine turns some of the chemical energy of fuel into motion, but a large fraction becomes heat that must be carried away. Power stations do the same on a grand scale. They are surrounded by cooling towers, condensers, rivers, seawater systems, and all the infrastructure required to manage the heat that cannot be turned into electricity. If perfect recycling of heat into work were possible, the industrial world would look very different. Engines would have no need to dump warmth into exhaust pipes, radiators, rivers, or the air. Yet every practical power system on Earth is built around the reality that heat refuses to come back whole. There is a subtle emotional difficulty here, and it helps to say it plainly. Conservation of energy sounds so reassuring that people often assume it must mean reversibility in practice. If nothing is lost, then why not simply restore everything? But conservation tells you the amount. It does not tell you the condition. It tells you the money is still in the economy, not that it is still in your pocket, sorted, folded, and ready to spend on the same thing. The second wall is about the condition, and once you notice that, a great deal of the world becomes more understandable. It explains why burned fuel cannot simply be reassembled by wishful thinking. It explains why friction is more than a nuisance. It explains why all machines get warmer somewhere. It explains why cooling is never free. It explains why time seems to have a direction in ordinary processes, because the spreading of useful differences gives many events a clear before and after. A hot cup cools. A cool room does not spontaneously heat one corner at the expense of the rest. A rolling ball stops. A stopped ball does not spontaneously gather warm floor vibrations into motion and roll away. The second wall, then, is not merely a rule about engines. It is a rule about what happens when the world does anything real. Useful differences are precious. Once spent, they cannot be perfectly reclaimed inside the same closed story. Some of the energy remains, certainly, but less of it remains available in the neat, directed form the machine needs. That is why perpetual motion of the second kind, the sort that tries to recycle heat entirely into renewed work, fails even though total energy is conserved. The books balance, but the cash has all come back as pennies scattered across the pavement. And there is a practical cruelty in how ordinary this process is. Heat does not announce itself as a grand cosmic principle while it ruins your design. It arrives quietly. A bearing warms a little, a wire warms a little, a fluid mixes, a temperature difference softens, a part flexes and relaxes, sound carries energy away, air stirs, surfaces rub, nothing dramatic, no thunderclap of impossibility, just 1,000 tiny escapes from order into spread out forms that are harder to recover. Which is why, from here, the conversation naturally moves to the countless small betrayals that real machines suffer, because once the second wall is understood, the everyday sabotage of friction, leakage, drag, and material imperfection begins to look less like a collection of accidents and more like the local face of a very deep rule. Now we arrive at the part of the story that most people notice first, because it is the part you can hear, feel, and occasionally smell when a machine is behaving badly. Even if a person has never heard a careful discussion of energy conservation, and even if the language of thermodynamics has never once brightened their afternoon, they still know that machines have a habit of losing their dignity in very ordinary ways. Wheels slow down, hinges squeak, bearings warm, belts slip, seals drip, wires heat up, lubes break down, air resists motion with that quiet persistence that makes bicycles humbler than their riders often are. Nothing in a real machine stays perfectly obedient for very long. This is why perpetual motion is so often blamed on engineering first and only later on physics. When a self-running design fails, the inventor is naturally tempted to say that the concept is sound and the practical details are the real villains. The wheel would have worked if the bearings were smoother, the magnet motor would have worked if the alignment were more precise, the fluid system would have worked if the seals did not leak, the pendulum would have kept going if the air had not interfered. The machine is always imagined as being one better workshop away from vindication. That instinct is understandable because engineering imperfections are real. They are not imaginary excuses. They ruin designs all the time. A real bearing does resist motion. A real shaft does flex. A real axle does warm. Lubricants do not behave like ideal thoughts. Materials are not perfectly rigid, not perfectly smooth, not perfectly elastic, and not perfectly willing to spend their lives turning in circles without complaint. The world of actual machinery is full of tiny betrayals, but the more closely we look, the more interesting those betrayals become, because they are not random acts of bad manners by matter. Friction, leaks, drag, electrical resistance, vibration, and internal damping are not separate little goblins hiding in different corners of the workshop. They are all ways in which organised motion is redistributed into less useful forms. They are the local habits through which the larger thermodynamic rules show themselves. In other words, the sabotage is quiet because it does not feel philosophical. It feels mechanical. Yet beneath every squeak and every warm bearing is the same deeper story about energy spreading out. Friction is the most famous of these saboteurs, and perhaps the most unfairly simplified. People often speak as though friction were just surfaces being rude to one another. That is not entirely wrong, but it is not much of an explanation either. When two surfaces rub, they are not really smooth at the microscopic level. They are full of tiny irregularities, tiny peaks and hollows, tiny regions that press, catch, deform, and release. Even when something feels polished to the touch, matter up close has texture. As surfaces slide, those microscopic contacts bend and break. Energy that was once part of the large-scale motion of the whole machine is transferred into tiny deformations, vibrations, and heat. That is why a spinning shaft warms its bearings, why rubbing your hands together produces warmth, and why brakes on a bicycle or car become hot. The motion has not disappeared. It has simply been pushed downward into smaller, more chaotic forms. The wheel no longer possesses that energy as a neat rotation you can put to work. The brake pads and rotor now possess it as warmth, and warmth is much less cooperative when you ask it to turn back into the original motion without losses. Lubrication helps, of course. A good lubricant separates surfaces, reduces direct contact, and allows motion with far less resistance. Engineers have spent centuries improving oils, greases, bearings, films, and surface finishes for exactly this reason. But lubrication does not abolish the problem. It only changes how the problem behaves. The fluid itself has internal resistance. It shears, it warms, it circulates. The surfaces still deform. The materials still respond to load. The losses can become very small, but they do not vanish into a romantic sunset simply because the machine was expensive. Air is another quiet saboteur, and one that often gets underestimated because it looks so harmless. Air seems light, soft, almost absent until you cycle into a headwind or hear a badly designed fan complaining from across the room. Move an object through air, and the air must be pushed aside. It swirls, compresses a little, accelerates, forms wakes, forms turbulence, makes sound, warms slightly, and generally insists that motion is a social activity rather than a private one. A spinning wheel does not only turn itself, it stirs the fluid around it. A pendulum does not simply swing, it drags air with it. A rotor does not merely rotate, it announces itself to the atmosphere, which then sends an invoice. Vacuum chambers are often introduced at this point in perpetual motion discussions with the confident tone of a person about to rescue the entire concept. "Fine," says the inventor, "remove the air, put the device in a vacuum, then the drag disappears, and the wheel will continue." It is true that removing air can dramatically reduce losses. Objects coast longer in vacuum, pendulums swing longer, rotors keep spinning longer. This is all perfectly real, but longer is not forever, and low loss is not no loss. Bearings still exist, internal stresses still exist, materials still flex, fields still interact, and if the device is asked to do useful work, the stored motion still declines, because output is never decorative. One of the most revealing facts about real machinery is that nothing is perfectly rigid. This matters much more than intuition first suggests. When a shaft turns under load, it twists a little. When gears mesh, their teeth deform slightly. When wheels roll, contact patches flatten. Springs never behave with perfect loyalty. Frames vibrate, casings resonate. Even metals that appear strong and unmoving are constantly yielding by tiny amounts under forces. These deformations may be microscopic, but they are not free. As materials flex and relax, some energy is not returned in the exact tidy way the ideal sketchbook version would promise. Part of it becomes internal heating, part becomes sound, part travels as vibrations through the structure and into the surroundings. This is why a machine can sound tired before it looks tired. The system is not merely making noise for dramatic effect. It is leaking organized motion into vibrations that disperse through the frame, the floor, the air, and eventually everything else nearby. The hum of a motor, the whine of gears, the hiss of airflow, the knock of looseness, the buzz of resonance, all of these are signs that the machine is sharing its energy with the environment in ways that do not usually improve performance. Sound is a particularly good example because it reminds us how many channels for loss exist beyond the obvious. A machine need not visibly slow in a dramatic way to be giving itself away. If it is making noise, it is launching pressure waves into the air or into surrounding structures. Those waves spread, reflect, dissipate, and end up as heat somewhere else. Nobody hears a squeaking hinge and thinks, "Excellent, the energy remains perfectly available for my future use." The sound itself tells you that order is escaping. Then there are leaks, which have a special talent for turning practical engineering into philosophy. A fluid system rarely keeps everything where the diagram promised it would stay. Seals age, gaskets harden, clearances widen, pressure differences find pathways, tiny droplets appear where tiny droplets were not invited. A hydraulic system that loses fluid is obvious enough in its misbehavior, but even when no visible leak is present, fluids can seep internally, flow around imperfections or mix in unwanted ways. Pressure equalizes, temperature gradients flatten, concentrations drift. Once again, the theme is the same. Useful differences tend to fade unless maintained. The word leak can be understood more broadly than dripping liquid. Electrical circuits leak in their own ways, charge redistributes, resistance warms wires, magnetic fields induce unwanted currents in nearby conductors. Insulation is never a metaphysical concept, it is just very good discouragement. Thermal systems leak too. A hot tank cools, a cold compartment warms. Heat crosses walls, joints, seals, and interfaces. No barrier is perfect. The only question is how quickly the contrast erodes. That erosion of contrast is devastating for any design that dreams of self-sufficiency, because useful machines live on contrasts. A pressure difference drives flow, a voltage difference drives current, a temperature difference drives heat engines, a height difference drives falling water. The moment those differences flatten, the machine is like a mill with no river. Everything important may still be physically present, but nothing wants to happen anymore. This helps explain why perpetual motion proposals so often rely on idealization. On paper, the seal does not age. In the animation, the bearing does not warm. In the sketch, the shaft does not flex. In the model, The magnet does not induce side effects in conductive parts, the air does not stir, the lubricant does not shear, and the supports do not vibrate. A drawing is a magnificent place to build an impossible machine because the drawing never insists on becoming real. The reality is that even very high-quality machines are elaborate exercises in damage control. Engineers do not eliminate losses, they manage them. They reduce friction, distribute heat, damp vibrations, align shafts, balance rotors, choose materials, control tolerances, and design maintenance schedules, precisely because matter is always looking for a less organized arrangement than the one the machine requires. Good engineering is the art of holding that tendency at bay long enough for something useful to happen. Consider a well-made flywheel. It is often the closest thing people have seen to the dream. Spin it up and it stores rotational energy beautifully. With low friction bearings and careful balance, it can continue for a remarkably long time. This can make it feel almost eerie, as though motion itself has taken up residence. But if you examine the setup honestly, the picture changes. The flywheel required energy to be spun up in the first place. It loses energy slowly through bearings, air drag unless in vacuum, internal material losses, vibration, and whatever load you attach to it. The longer it lasts, the more impressive the engineering is. The fact that it eventually runs down tells you the deeper truth. The same applies to superconducting and cryogenic systems, though they deserve their own careful treatment later. Reduce electrical resistance enough and currents can persist for astonishingly long times. Reduce mechanical losses enough and motion can seem nearly immortal by everyday standards. Yet these cases are not proof that the universe has changed its mind. They're examples of how dramatically persistence can improve when certain loss channels are suppressed. Suppressed is not abolished, and persistent is not productive in the perpetual motion sense unless the system can also do continuing external work without fresh support. This is why the inventor who blames friction is both wrong and not entirely wrong. Friction really is a problem, so are drag, leakage, resistance, vibration, and wear. They really do kill machines, remove them and performance improves. But the inventor is wrong to imagine that these are merely accidental obstacles placed in front of an otherwise allowed miracle. They are more like the visible local expressions of the same general rule. Even if one loss channel is reduced dramatically, others remain, and beneath them all lies the fact that organized motion and useful differences are always at risk of dispersal. Wear deserves a mention too, because it adds a cruel longer-term version of the same theme. It is not enough for a machine to run efficiently for a short time. If it is to live in the real world, surfaces must survive contact, loads must remain aligned, materials must resist fatigue, and tolerances must stay within reason. Real machines do not only lose energy from moment to moment, they also lose themselves. Bearings, pit, shafts loosen, seals crack, surfaces score, springs weaken, lubricants become contaminated. That slow physical decay means a machine that once coasted elegantly can later begin complaining in several dialects at once. The universe does not merely oppose perpetual motion by taking the energy. It also quietly rearranges the machine into something less capable of making use of what remains. There is something almost comic in how many ways reality can undermine a device. Suppose you reduce friction. Fine. Now thermal expansion changes your tolerances. Suppose you improve alignment. Fine. Now vibration finds a structural resonance. Suppose you fix the resonance. Fine. Now lubrication chemistry becomes the limiting issue. Suppose you solve that. Fine. Now seals age under temperature cycling. Machines are like arguments with the physical world that can be won locally, but never once and for all. The world always replies in another accent. And yet none of this should sound like a complaint against engineering. Quite the opposite. The brilliance of engineering lies in how much can be achieved in spite of all this quiet sabotage. Turbines spin at astonishing speeds. Motors run for years. Spacecraft survive hostile conditions. Clocks keep exquisite time. Power grids function across continents. Precision instruments detect ridiculously small effects. This is all magnificent. But it is magnificent precisely because reality is not easy. The success of real machines does not suggest perpetual motion is near. It shows how skilled we have become at working within hard limits. There is also a useful philosophical correction here. People sometimes imagine that if friction and all related losses were somehow removed, then perpetual motion would naturally appear as the default state of machinery. But even that grants too much to the dream. A perfectly isolated object could continue moving indefinitely in ideal mechanics, yes, but that is not the same as a machine delivering endless useful work in a cycle. The moment you ask for output, you reintroduce a drain. The moment you close a realistic loop, you face the first and second walls again. Quiet sabotage makes the failure faster and more obvious, but it is not the whole explanation. Still, it matters that the sabotage is quiet, because quiet things are persuasive in the wrong direction. A machine rarely stops with a moral lecture. It warms a little here, vibrates a little there, loses a tiny bit of pressure, radiates a small amount of sound, stirs the air, shifts its lubricant, and gradually hands away the order that once made it seem powerful. A builder watching this may conclude that the problem is merely one of polishing the details. Sometimes that is true for practical improvement. It is never true as a route to endless self-sustaining output. This is why the history of perpetual motion had to become the history of thermodynamics. So long as people treated each failure as a local workshop disappointment, the dream could survive by migrating from one mechanism to another. This wheel failed because of friction. That one failed because of poor magnets. This pump failed because of leaks. That pendulum failed because of air. The concept was never allowed to stand trial as a concept. Only the implementations were blamed. Eventually, though, science learned to see through the parade of practical excuses and ask a more serious question. What kind of universal rules are these annoyances hinting at? Why do so many different loss channels all seem to drive organised motion toward warmth, mixing, levelling and decline? Why do useful gradients keep flattening? Why does every attempt at a self-sustaining machine run into not just one nuisance, but an entire family of them, all aligned in the same direction? Once those questions are asked properly, the answer becomes much broader than any squeaky bearing or leaking seal, and from there the refusal of nature stops looking like a collection of mechanical inconveniences and starts looking like a law that had been present all along, waiting for physics to learn how to say no with confidence. For a long time, the dream of endless motion survived because failure could always be blamed on the machine rather than on nature. If a wheel stopped, perhaps the bearings were poor. If a pump disappointed, perhaps the seals were sloppy. If a swinging mechanism ran down, perhaps the craftsman had not yet mastered the timing. The hope remained intact because the argument was never really forced into the open. People could go on believing that somewhere, behind the smoke and squeaking metal and disappointing demonstrations, a truly self-sustaining machine might still be waiting for the right hands. What changed was not only machinery, but the way people began thinking about machinery. The crucial step was learning to stop treating each device as an isolated curiosity and to start asking larger questions about all devices at once. Why do so many different machines fail in ways that seem oddly related? Why does useful motion so often end up as warmth? Why does every engine need not just fuel, but also a place to dump heat? Why do hot things cool down? Pressure differences relax, and all these carefully prepared contrasts wear away with such stubborn regularity. Those questions are what eventually gave rise to thermodynamics, which is one of the least romantic sounding names for one of the most decisive intellectual victories in the history of science. It did not arrive all at once. Like most powerful ideas, it grew from practical trouble. People were not originally trying to build a majestic theory of heat for the beauty of it. They were trying to improve engines, understand steam, manage work and make machines perform better. The industrial world had powerful reasons to care. Mines flooded, factories needed motion, Transport needed power. Fuel cost money. Efficiency mattered. A machine that wasted less coal was not just philosophically interesting, it was commercially, politically, and socially important. That pressure helped turn vague intuitions into sharper questions. At first, heat itself was poorly understood. People knew heat as something familiar and unavoidable. Things became hot when rubbed, burned, compressed, or worked hard. Steam engines turned heat into motion in some manner that was useful even if not fully understood. One older view imagined heat as a kind of subtle fluid, often called caloric, that flowed from one body to another. That picture was not completely foolish. Heat does behave in ways that make flow a tempting metaphor. Warm objects do warm cooler ones. Temperature differences do tend to equalize. The idea captured something, but not everything. It did not fully explain how mechanical work and heat could transform into one another. That transformation began to look more important as experiment improved. When a cannon borer or a drill or a set of rubbing surfaces produced heat, it became harder to believe that heat was merely a conserved fluid being moved around unchanged. Mechanical action seemed able to generate heat in abundance. This was a crucial shift, because it began linking work and heat in a much tighter way. Heat was not some entirely separate essence living its own life. It was deeply connected to motion and matter. Even so, understanding that connection clearly took time. People needed not just observations, but a new style of reasoning. They had to stop asking only what a machine did and start asking what all conceivable machines were allowed to do. That sounds abstract, but it was a brilliant move. Instead of getting lost in the details of one particular engine, with one particular piston, and one particular designer, thinkers began comparing idealized machines. If one could imagine the best possible engine, what limits would still remain? If one could strip away bad craftsmanship and focus on principle, what could never be surpassed no matter how clever the engineer? This is where one of the great figures enters the story, even if quietly. Saidi Carnot, working in the early 19th century, asked how efficient a heat engine could possibly be. He was not yet working with the modern picture of energy in full form, and some of the conceptual language around him was still tied to older ideas, but his question was revolutionary because it framed the matter in terms of limits. What is the best any engine could do? Not just in practice, but in principle.
Once that question is posed, perpetual motion begins to lose its favorite hiding places. Carnot realized that heat engines rely on a temperature difference. They operate between something hot and something colder. That simple idea has enormous consequences. It means the engine is not extracting useful work from heat in the abstract. It is extracting work from the flow of heat as it moves from a hotter region to a cooler one. The difference is everything. A perfectly uniform world, all at one temperature, would not give the engine a reason to run. There would be heat in such a world, perhaps a great deal of it, but no contrast to exploit. This was already a strong blow against certain fantasies. It meant that heat was not an endlessly reusable treasure chest waiting to be converted into work at will. Heat could do useful things under conditions, and those conditions included gradients, differences, inequalities that nature tends to wear down. The moment you begin to see engines this way, the dream of a machine that feeds perfectly on its own leftover warmth starts looking much less plausible. The machine would have to recreate the very difference it had already spent and do so without outside help. That is exactly the sort of magical bookkeeping thermodynamics grew up to distrust. As the 19th century continued, the old fluid picture of heat gave way to something stronger.
James Prescott Joule and others established with increasing clarity that mechanical work and heat are equivalent in a deep sense. Work done against resistance becomes heat. Electrical currents warm conductors. Falling weights can stir fluids and raise their temperature. Heat and work are not unrelated currencies. They are connected forms within the same overall economy. This was a decisive moment because it helped clarify what later became the first law of thermodynamics. Energy is conserved. You do not get more total useful capacity out than the full account allows. That first law was already bad news for the classic machine that promised more output than input. It formalized, with sober authority, the wall we have already been discussing. The universe keeps the books. Energy may change form, but it does not appear from nowhere just because a wheel has good posture. Once this principle became firmly established, a whole class of perpetual motion proposals stopped being ingenious challenges and started being direct contradictions. The machine of the first kind, the sort that claims to create useful energy from nothing, was now plainly incompatible with the law. But thermodynamics did not stop there, because conservation alone was not enough. You could conserve energy perfectly and still fail to explain why engines must waste heat, why friction has a direction, why a hot cup cools, why motion fades into warmth, and why so many real processes seem to prefer one way of unfolding rather than the other. This is where the second law enters, and with it thermodynamics learned not merely to say no, but to say no with extraordinary precision. The second law is difficult to introduce without sounding either too grand or too dry, both of which would be regrettable. In plain terms, it tells us that not all forms of energy are equally available for doing useful work, and that natural processes tend to move towards states in which useful differences are less concentrated and less exploitable. It is a law about direction as much as amount. It tells us why certain transformations happen easily, and their exact reversals do not happen freely in the same casual way. One reason this mattered so much is that it explained why perfect heat recovery is not available even in principle. You cannot take all the heat in a body at one temperature and turn it completely into work in a cycle without something else changing. You need a temperature difference. You need a sink. You need somewhere for some of the heat to go. There is always a residue of less available energy left behind. That single fact destroyed the machine of the second kind, the one that hoped not to create energy from nothing, but to recycle all energy perfectly into renewed usefulness without any outside cost. What is so impressive about thermodynamics is that it reached these conclusions not by examining every possible failed machine one at a time, but by establishing a framework broad enough to catch them all. That is how science often becomes powerful. It stops chasing individual excuses and starts articulating general constraints. Once the laws were in place, the inventor could no longer say this particular wheel is special, or these magnets are arranged unlike any before, or this fluid cycle has escaped the old problems. The reply was no longer mechanical guesswork, it was conceptual law. Show us the source, show us the gradients, show us the full cycle, show us how the accounting closes without violating conservation or the directional tendency of real processes. Otherwise, the machine does not merely seem unlikely. It collides with the structure of the theory. There is something almost judicial about that change. Before thermodynamics, perpetual motion proposals could still behave like charismatic defendants charming a confused room. After thermodynamics, the court had learned procedure. It knew what questions to ask. It knew where hidden assumptions usually lurked. It knew that local gains mean little without full-cycle analysis.
It knew that if a machine ends where it began while also delivering useful work and receiving no fresh source, then something has been smuggled in or overlooked. The age of vague wonder gave way, slowly, to disciplined suspicion. That suspicion was not cynicism, it was earned clarity. It came from understanding engines well enough to know what they needed, heat well enough to know what it could and could not do, and work well enough to track what had actually happened over a process. Thermodynamics was not a petty doctrine designed to embarrass inventors. It was the summary of what every honest engine and every stubborn failure had been trying to tell people all along. One of the most important conceptual tools in this development was the idea of reversible processes. Real processes are messy, but by imagining idealized, perfectly controlled changes, physicists could define limits with great sharpness. A reversible engine was not meant as a practical machine someone could build in an ordinary workshop. It was a theoretical standard, an ideal case that wasted nothing beyond what the laws themselves made unavoidable. And once that ideal was defined, it became possible to say something profound. Even the best conceivable engine, the most delicately managed and perfectly idealized one, still could not escape the second law. If even the ideal case had a ceiling, then real engines with all their leaking seals and protesting bearings had no chance of crossing it.
That was a turning point in how impossibility itself was understood. Usually when something is impossible in ordinary life, we suspect hidden practical limitations. Perhaps better materials would solve it. Perhaps better tools. Perhaps a more advanced civilization could achieve it. But thermodynamic impossibility is different. It is not a statement about our temporary incompetence. It is a statement about what nature allows no matter how advanced the workshop becomes. That gives the refusal a very different weight. The dream is not postponed, it is ruled out. And yet, even after this intellectual victory, people did not stop proposing perpetual motion machines. That is part of what makes the history so human. Scientific laws can become clearer without becoming emotionally persuasive to everyone at once. The inventor still sees the turning wheel. The viewer still feels the old pull of apparent asymmetry. The practical mind still wants to believe that official theory has missed some tiny opening. There is always another demonstration, another scheme, another argument that friction alone was the problem, another claim that standard thermodynamics only applies under boring conditions unlike the thrilling conditions present in this garage right now. In a way, this persistence only confirms how strong the original temptation was. It also confirms why thermodynamics had to learn to say no so carefully. A casual no was never enough. People needed the reasons. They needed to understand why conservation forbids one class of machines, and why the directionality of heat and the degradation of useful energy forbid another. They needed to see why local cleverness cannot defeat full cycle accounting. They needed a language for hidden costs, for the erosion of gradients, for the way the world converts ordered processes into less directed forms. As thermodynamics matured, this language became increasingly precise. Concepts such as entropy gave physicists a way to describe the tendency of systems toward more spread out, less specifically useful arrangements. That concept is often made to sound mysterious in popular talk, but in this context its role is straightforward enough. It helps quantify why certain processes are naturally favoured and why the neat reversal of those processes requires more than a wish. It explains why the universe is so obliging when a hot object cools, and so uncooperative when asked to have a cool object spontaneously grow hotter by draining the rest of the room. Once that view is in place, the impossibility of perpetual motion begins to look less like an arbitrary ban and more like a consequence of everything we see around us. The cooling tea, the warming brake pad, the fading swing, the mixing cream, the dissipating vortex, the tired battery, the expanding gas, the wearing gear train, all of them are local expressions of the same broad truth. Thermodynamics did not invent these disappointments.
It simply learned how to read them as one coherent message. That coherence is what finally made the no so powerful. It united steam engines, chemical processes, mechanical friction, heat flow, and countless everyday observations into one framework. The workshop, the factory, and the laboratory all began telling the same story. You can transform energy. You can direct it for a time. You can exploit differences. You can build extraordinary machines. But you cannot conjure endless useful output from a closed system, and you cannot perfectly recycle all spent usefulness once the world has started flattening the very gradients you depend on. There is a strange kind of comfort in that, though perhaps not the sort inventors of impossible wheels were hoping for. The universe is not teasing us with near misses forever. It is consistent. Once the laws are understood, the failures stop being personal insults and become intelligible consequences. The wheel did not stop because fate was unkind to this particular craftsman. It stopped because all such wheels live under the same jurisdiction. The engine dumped heat not because the engineer lacked imagination, but because engines always negotiate with a world that insists some differences will be spent rather than perfectly reclaimed. And that is why thermodynamics marks such an important transition in the story. Before it, people could still imagine that enough ingenuity might eventually wear nature down.
After it, the relationship reversed. Ingenuity remained immensely valuable, but only within the limits nature had made clear. The question was no longer how to build an impossible machine. It was how to build the best possible machine inside a lawful universe. That change gave us real engineering rather than fantasy, real efficiency rather than magical claims, and a much sharper understanding of why even the most perfect-looking machine cannot ultimately outwit the tendency of useful order to spread, soften, and drift. At this point, the old dream usually retreats to its most respectable hiding place. Fine, it says, ordinary machines fail because they are crude. Real bearings warm, real materials flex, real fluids leak, real surfaces rub and resist. Real workshops are full of defects, tolerances, dust, misalignment, vibration, and all the other indignities that matter patiently imposes on any device built by human hands. But what if we strip all that away? What if we imagine not a clumsy wheel in a medieval sketchbook or a noisy contraption on a modern garage bench, but a truly perfect machine? No friction, no leaks, no wear, no sloppy timing, no wasted motion, no sound, no heat escaping where it should not, no electrical resistance, no badly fitting parts, no hidden roughness, no practical nuisance of any kind. Would that not finally open the door? It is a fair question, and in some ways it is the most important version of the whole topic, because it forces us to separate two different ideas that are easy to blur together. One idea is that real machines fail because they are imperfect. The other is that some machines fail because the task itself is forbidden even under perfect conditions. If perpetual motion belonged only to the first category, then better engineering might one day rescue it. But if it belongs to the second, then the dream dies not because our tools are poor, but because the universe is not built to permit that kind of success. This is where entropy enters the story with all the calm authority of something that has never needed to raise its voice. Entropy is one of those words that has acquired an unfortunate reputation for sounding mystical, when it is really trying to be precise. People hear it and imagine cosmic decay, philosophical gloom, or the general feeling of a drawer becoming untidy while you're not looking. Those associations are not entirely useless, but they are not enough. In the present context, entropy is a way of talking about how energy and matter can be arranged, and about why some arrangements are naturally easier for the world to realize than others. It helps explain why certain changes happen readily, why their reversals do not happen for free, and why perfect machinery still cannot keep useful order cycling forever without cost. One simple way to approach it is to think about the difference between a highly arranged state and a more spread out one. A neatly stacked deck of cards is one kind of arrangement. A thoroughly shuffled deck is another. Both involve the same cards. Nothing has been added or destroyed. Yet one arrangement is very special, and the other is vastly more typical. There are enormously many scrambled orders, and comparatively few that look neatly structured in the particular way we call ordered. If you keep disturbing the deck casually, it moves toward the more common state. It does not spontaneously return to the neat arrangement just because the total number of cards remains the same. That is not a perfect analogy for thermodynamics, but it points in the right direction. The issue is not whether the ingredients still exist. They do. The issue is how many ways the ingredients can be arranged while still matching the broad condition we observe. A concentrated temperature difference, for example, is a more specific and less common arrangement than a more even temperature spread. A gas crowded into one corner of a room is a more specific arrangement than the same gas distributed throughout the room. A wheel whose energy is gathered into a clean rotation is a more specific arrangement than a machine and environment together, holding the same total energy as a diffuse warmth spread across countless microscopic motions. This is why the perfect machine does not save the dream. Even if you imagine every ordinary loss channel removed, you have not removed the deeper fact that useful arrangements are special. They are not the overwhelmingly common way for a closed system to be. The machine can begin in a beautiful, organized condition with energy concentrated in some form that can do work. But if it is truly closed and asked to operate continuously, then it must keep cycling through states while producing useful effects. Those useful effects depend on maintained differences, maintained order, maintained availability.
The moment the system evolves in any realistic thermodynamic sense, there is a tendency for the energy to become less specifically arranged for the machine's purposes. The total remains. The usefulness does not remain so obligingly. It helps to return for a moment to heat, because heat is the place where this truth becomes painfully visible. Suppose you have a perfect engine in the most charitable imaginable sense. It has no friction in the casual workshop meaning, no sloppy joints, no sound, no stray deformation that wastes motion. It operates with ideal control. Even then, if it is a heat engine, it still needs a hotter place and a cooler place. It still cannot take heat from one single uniform temperature source and turn all of it into work in a repeating cycle. That limit is not the fault of bad craftsmanship. It is bound up with the fact that the engine would otherwise be demanding a spontaneous concentration of usefulness from a form of energy that is already too spread out. The word spread out matters here. When a system has energy in a neatly directed motion, like a spinning rotor, that energy is highly coordinated. When a system has energy as warmth spread through the countless random microscopic motions of atoms and molecules, the energy is still real, but not neatly coordinated. There are huge numbers of microscopic ways to realize that warm, messy condition. There are far fewer ways to realize the clean, specific motion of the rotor.
So when a closed system evolves, it is overwhelmingly likely to move toward conditions that can be realized in more ways, not fewer. That is the statistical heart of entropy. It is not a demon pushing things downhill. It is the enormous imbalance between rare, highly structured arrangements and common, spread out ones. Once you see that, the perfect machine begins to look less like a loophole and more like a misunderstanding. Perfection of construction is not perfection against statistics. You can imagine a machine with flawless parts, but you cannot imagine away the fact that a closed system has far more disordered microscopic states than specially organized ones. The machine would somehow have to keep shepherding the system back into the narrow corridor of useful arrangement without spending anything extra to do so. That is exactly what entropy forbids on average in a closed setting. There is a temptation here to protest that microscopic physics is reversible in many cases. If the underlying laws allow motion to run backward, then why should entropy have such power? Why should a perfect machine not simply choreograph reversibility so elegantly that the old losses never arise in the first place? This is a subtle question, and it goes to the heart of why entropy can seem so slippery. At the microscopic level, many interactions do not themselves point in an obvious time direction, but the macroscopic world we actually live in deals with vast numbers of particles and vast numbers of possible arrangements. In that setting, the special initial conditions required for large-scale order are extraordinarily delicate. A tiny lack of exact control is enough for the system to wander into the vastly larger space of more disordered possibilities. A useful image is a drop of ink in water. In principle, if one knew the exact position and motion of every molecule and could reverse them with impossible precision, one might imagine the ink unmixing itself and returning to a neat drop. But in practice, and in ordinary nature, the mixed state is what we see, because there are incomparably many more ways for the molecules to be arranged as a mixed solution than as one tidy drop suspended in clear water. The perfect machine fantasy asks, in effect, for the universe to keep unmixing what it has already mixed, and to do so continuously and freely. That is not what closed systems do on their own. This is why even an idealized perpetual motion machine of the second kind fails. It is not enough to say that no energy is lost. One must also say how the machine avoids the drift from more usable forms to less usable ones. One must say how it keeps rebuilding gradients, rebuilding structure, rebuilding concentration without paying a cost elsewhere. And that is precisely the impossible part. Entropy does not mean that everything becomes useless at once. It means that in a closed system, the general tendency is for useful distinctions to erode rather than spontaneously restore themselves. Real life is full of local decreases in disorder, of course, and that sometimes causes confusion. Snowflakes form, crystals grow. Living cells build astonishing structure. Refrigerators make one compartment colder. Cities rise, books are written, rooms are tidied briefly. Does this not show that entropy is a bit too pessimistic? Not at all. These local increases in order occur because the system doing the ordering is not closed in the relevant sense. A refrigerator cools its interior by dumping even more heat into the room and consuming electrical work. A living organism maintains its internal order by taking in energy and matter and exporting waste and heat. Crystals form because the broader environment allows that local pattern to emerge, while overall entropy still increases. Order can arise locally, but not as a free gift in a sealed story with no bill attached. That point is so important that it is worth lingering over. Entropy does not say that nothing organised can exist. Clearly organised things exist everywhere, including anyone patient enough to alphabetize spices. What it says is that maintaining or creating organisation in one place generally requires compensation elsewhere. You can build a neat arrangement, but you do so by spending energy and increasing entropy overall.
The perpetual motion dream wants the neat arrangement to keep recreating itself indefinitely without that wider payment. That is why the dream keeps colliding with the law. One can phrase the problem in another way. A perfect machine would need perfect recurrence of usefulness. After each cycle, it would need to find itself in a condition equally capable of producing the next cycle, with no net decline in the quality of the available energy and no net increase in the hidden dispersal of the world around it. But once the machine interacts with anything in a way that counts as useful work, it has entered the business of directing flows and relaxing differences. Unless an external source keeps restoring those differences, the machine is spending a kind of one-way currency. It may spend it very elegantly. It may spend it slowly. It may delay the disappointment so long that an impatient observer mistakes longevity for immortality. But the direction of travel remains. This is also why highly ideal examples from classical mechanics do not rescue the larger dream. A perfectly isolated planet can orbit for a very long time. A frictionless puck can glide forever in an idealized thought experiment. A superconducting current can persist astonishingly well under special conditions. These cases are fascinating, and they do show that persistence without ordinary damping can be real. But persistence is not the same as a self-renewing source of useful work.
A planet in orbit is not powering your workshop for free. The moment you tap a supposedly perfect motion to extract continuous work, you're altering the conditions that made the persistence possible. The system is no longer just persisting, it is being drained. That distinction is where many casual arguments go astray. They say, look, motion can continue indefinitely in the absence of friction, therefore perpetual motion is possible. But the stronger claim people want is not mere indefinite motion of an isolated state. They want indefinite useful output in a cycle. They want the machine to keep doing something for them while returning endlessly to its own starting capacity. That step from persistence to productivity is exactly where entropy reappears like a very patient customs officer asking uncomfortable questions about what you're carrying across the border. There is also a more human way to understand this. Imagine a perfectly tidy room that you intend to use actively every day without ever cleaning it, reorganizing it, bringing in supplies or taking out trash. You might begin with an extraordinary arrangement, everything in its place, every surface clear, every item ready. But the room is only useful because of that arrangement, and use tends to disturb arrangement. If the room is truly closed to maintenance, the useful order degrades. That is not because the furniture is badly made. It is because the state of tidiness is a special state that requires upkeep against the more numerous ways the room can be less ordered. A machine is not a bedroom, mercifully, but the logic is similar. Utility lives in structure, gradients, arrangement, and these do not refresh themselves freely in a closed world. The power of entropy as an idea is that it makes this general. It is not a complaint about this bearing or that seal. It is not even only about heat engines. It is about the fate of organized availability in any closed process involving many degrees of freedom. That phrase may sound technical, but the intuition behind it is simple enough. The more ways there are for the pieces of a system to share out the energy, and the less special those shared out arrangements are, the harder it is to keep the energy confined to the narrow forms that a machine can use so obediently. There is a quiet cruelty in how this works. The perfect machine may perform beautifully for a while in thought. It may even look like the sort of thing one wishes nature rewarded. But entropy does not care how polished the device is. It does not care how clever the inventor was, how symmetrical the wheel appears, or how lovingly the gears were imagined. It only cares, if that word can be borrowed, about the balance of possible arrangements and the broad direction in which closed systems evolve, which is why perfection of craftsmanship cannot bargain its way out of a statistical law. And yet this is not a counsel of despair. It is a description of the game we are actually playing. Real technology succeeds not by defeating entropy, but by working with gradients that exist, by importing energy, by exporting waste, by maintaining local order at acceptable broader cost. A power plant works because it has fuel and a sink. A living body works because it takes in food and releases heat and waste. A refrigerator works because electricity drives heat outward. A spacecraft works because it was launched with stored energy and continues exchanging energy with its environment in specific ways. None of this is lesser because it is not perpetual motion. It is more impressive, really, because it is honest. In fact, once you accept entropy, the world becomes more interesting, not less. You stop looking for impossible free renewals and start noticing the subtler question of how order survives at all. How does a cell keep itself far from equilibrium? How do stars shine for ages before running down? How do ecosystems persist? How do currents continue in special materials? How can machines be made so efficient that their decline becomes almost slow enough to feel supernatural? These are deeper questions than the old fantasy, and they lead to far richer physics. Still, the old fantasy has one last refuge, because whenever a law seems absolute, the imagination begins searching the edges. Very well, someone says, perhaps ordinary machines fail and even perfect classical machines fail. But what about the strange cases in nature that look almost like exceptions? What about bodies in orbit that seem to coast forever? What about superfluids that flow with eerie persistence? What about superconductors, where currents can keep going with astonishingly little loss? What about the quantum world, where so many ordinary intuitions have already been embarrassed? Surely, if perpetual motion has any cousins worth meeting, they will be found there, in the places where nature looks closest to granting the old dream just enough reality to keep us staring a little longer. This is the part of the story where the dream seems to recover a little dignity, because if one looks around nature with a forgiving eye, there are indeed systems that appear to come very close to the old fantasy. They move for astonishingly long times. They persist with such calm indifference to ordinary loss that they can seem almost supernatural by everyday standards. They do not creak, do not visibly tire, and do not behave like the objects on kitchen tables and workshop benches that slow down within minutes. If one were determined to defend the possibility of something like perpetual motion, this is where one would go first. One would point upward to the sky, downward into low-temperature laboratories, and inward toward the strange calm of quantum matter. Look, one would say, perhaps nature herself has been doing it all along. That instinct is not foolish. It is exactly the right place to look if one wants to understand both how far persistence can go and why persistence is still not the same as endless useful work. These systems are the closest imitations nature offers. They are not trivial curiosities. They are deep, real, and in some cases genuinely astonishing. But each of them also teaches the same sobering lesson. Nature can preserve motion with extraordinary care under the right conditions. What she does not hand out is a machine that powers itself forever while also doing whatever useful task we ask of it, without fresh input or wider cost. The first example is the oldest and most visible of all. The heavens themselves seem to mock the ordinary failures of earthly machines. A spinning top on a table slows. A wheel on an axle warms and eventually stops. A pendulum loses its swing unless fed. Yet planets circle stars for billions of years. Moons orbit planets. The Earth turns day after day with such reliability that most of us do not spend our afternoons nervously checking whether rotation is still underway. If anything in the universe looks like motion that simply carries on, surely it is orbital motion, and in a limited sense, that intuition is correct. An orbit is a magnificent example of sustained motion, under conditions where the ordinary drains of daily life are almost absent. There is no axle rubbing in the void between Earth and Sun. There is no air thick enough to drag a planet to a halt. Space is not a workshop. A planet in orbit is not continuously pushing through the sort of resistant medium that makes bicycles humble and ceiling fans finite. It is following a path determined by gravity and inertia in a setting where large-scale dissipation can be very small. This is why orbits can last so long. They are not constantly spending themselves in the ways familiar machines do. The system was set up with a certain distribution of emotion and gravitational relationship, and under suitable conditions that arrangement can persist for immensely long periods. Seen from a human timescale, it is easy to mistake such persistence for eternity. The Earth has gone around the Sun so many times before any of us appeared that the distinction between very long-lived and effectively endless can feel almost pedantic. But the distinction matters. An orbit is not a perpetual motion machine in the strong sense people mean when they want one. The orbit is not giving you free useful work on demand while returning itself unchanged and unsupported. It is a dynamical state in which motion continues because the system is not suffering strong ordinary losses. The moment you ask it to do ongoing external work in a direct mechanical sense, the picture changes. If you could somehow tap the orbital energy of a body continuously to power some process, then the orbit would be altered. Energy taken from the motion is no longer in the motion. There is no miracle here, only a very large reservoir living in a very low-loss environment. Even natural orbits are not always perfectly permanent. Tidal effects transfer energy. Atmospheric drag affects low satellites. Gravitational radiation exists for certain extreme systems, though usually far too small to matter in ordinary planetary life. Interactions between bodies can slowly reshape orbits over immense spans. None of this makes orbital mechanics less beautiful. It only reminds us that persistence is not exemption. The heavens are not running on a loophole. They are simply operating under conditions where the familiar roots of loss are dramatically reduced, and the scales involved are enormous. There is also a psychological trick in orbital examples. The motion is grand, but the useful work we imagine extracting from it is usually left vague. A planet circling a star is moving, yes, but it is not automatically a power station. Motion alone is not the same as an endlessly reusable source of practical output. We benefit from celestial motions in all kinds of indirect ways, of course. The Sun and Earth system gives us seasons, climate structure, tides, and the long stability within which life and technology are possible. But that is not the same as a wheel in your workshop turning forever and grinding grain for free. The orbit persists because it is not being milked like that in a closed mechanical loop. If orbits are the oldest imitation, superfluids are among the strangest. Here we enter a world where matter behaves in ways so unfamiliar that the old dream begins to look almost refreshed. A superfluid is a fluid that, under very special low temperature conditions, can flow with astonishingly little internal resistance. This is already an unsettling statement if one has spent much time around ordinary liquids, which are forever dragging, swirling, dissipating, and making life difficult for anyone hoping for ideal behaviour. Superfluids are different. They can climb thin walls in films, form persistent circulations, and display collective behaviour that feels less like a kitchen liquid and more like a calm conspiracy among atoms. One of the most intriguing features of superfluids is that circulation within them can persist for a very long time. In carefully prepared situations, a superfluid can keep moving around a closed path with remarkably little decay. This is one of those cases where a headline can do great damage if handled without care. One hears that a fluid can flow forever and immediately the old machinery of wishful thinking starts whirring back into life. At last, one thinks, here is motion that really does not stop. Yet once again the difference between persistence and free useful output becomes decisive. A superfluid in persistent circulation is a specially prepared state. It requires special materials, special temperatures, special containment, and a setting in which ordinary dissipation is suppressed in extraordinary ways. That is not a small detail. It is the whole reason the effect exists. The fluid is not casually defeating thermodynamics. It is occupying an unusual quantum state under restrictive conditions, and that state can preserve motion with far less decay than ordinary fluids allow. More importantly, the circulation is not the same thing as a free engine. If you leave the superfluid circulating in its ring and merely admire it, then yes, it may persist for a very long time. But if you try to draw continuous useful work from that motion, in a way that is not already accounted for, you disturb the state and face the same deeper rules as everywhere else. The system is not a magical source. It is a low dissipation reservoir of motion under very special conditions. The distinction may sound severe, but it is exactly what keeps the physics honest. There is also the matter of preparation and maintenance. To obtain superfluid behaviour, one generally needs extremely low temperatures. Achieving and maintaining such temperatures is not free. It requires infrastructure, cooling methods, energy expenditure, and wider thermodynamic bookkeeping. The superfluid itself may show extraordinary persistence locally, but the broader story is not one of spontaneous free order. It is one of painstakingly created conditions within which a special kind of persistence becomes possible. Nature is showing what can happen when certain loss channels are reduced. She's not handing over an infinite motor. Superconductors offer an even more famous version of this temptation. In a superconductor, electrical resistance can drop to essentially zero under suitable conditions. That phrase alone has inspired a great number of hopeful misunderstandings. If ordinary wires warm up when current flows, and superconductors do not resist current in the same ordinary way, then perhaps at last we have found something that really does go on forever. In some sense, again, we have found a very remarkable imitation. Persistent currents in superconducting loops can indeed last for extremely long times. Once established, a current can keep circulating with astonishing fidelity. This is not fantasy. It is one of the real triumphs of modern physics, and it can feel, the first time one hears it, like the nearest thing science will ever admit to perpetual motion. After all, here is electrical motion of a kind continuing without the familiar penalty of resistive heating. No battery endlessly pushing, no copper wire warming, just current going round and round, apparently unwilling to grow tired, but the same caution returns. A persistent current in a superconducting ring is not a perpetual power plant. It is a carefully established quantum state in a closed loop under special conditions. If you simply let it exist, it can persist magnificently. If you try to tap it continuously for useful output in the ordinary sense, then you're no longer just observing persistence, you're drawing energy from the state. The state then changes unless the broader setup replenishes what you have taken. The current does not provide an endless surplus simply because it avoids one familiar kind of loss. This point can be unintuitive because resistance in daily electrical life is so closely associated with energy cost. Remove resistance, and it feels as though one has removed the whole problem, but resistance is not the same as the entire thermodynamic structure of doing work. A superconducting loop can preserve a current because it is not dissipating it in the ordinary way. That does not mean you can attach an endless external load and have the current cheerfully support it forever while the loop remains unchanged and unsupported. The moment energy leaves the circulating state to do something elsewhere, the books must still balance. And again, there is the wider condition that makes the marvel possible. Superconductivity usually requires low temperatures, often very low. Creating and holding those temperatures takes effort. There are materials, cryogenic systems, thermal shields, refrigeration stages, and all the surrounding machinery of modern experimental life. None of that is an embarrassment. It is part of the achievement. But it makes clear that what we are seeing is not a rebellion against thermodynamics. It is a sophisticated arrangement inside thermodynamics. In fact, one of the most useful ways to think about superconductors and superfluids is not as loopholes, but as demonstrations of how much ordinary dissipation depends on collective microscopic behavior. When matter enters certain ordered quantum states, some of the messy channels that usually scatter motion and degrade coherence become dramatically suppressed. The result can look uncanny because we are so used to loss. A current that lasts and a fluid that circulates with almost eerie calm seem nearly impossible by everyday standards. Yet what they really reveal is how contingent familiar resistance often is. Under the right circumstances, matter can behave with astonishing discipline. That is a profound insight, but it is not the same as free energy. Suppressing one route to disorder does not abolish the need for conditions, preparation, boundaries, and full cycle accounting. These systems preserve specially arranged motion very well. They do not generate endless useful output from nowhere, and they do not let a closed machine recycle all usefulness forever without wider cost. The old dream survives only if one blurs those distinctions, and physics has spent too long sharpening them to blur them now. There is another reason these examples are so captivating. They show that the phrase impossible does not mean nature is dull. The impossibility of perpetual motion does not imply that all motion must decay quickly, or that every system is equally wasteful. Quite the contrary. The universe allows astonishing degrees of persistence when the circumstances are right. A planet can circle for ages. A superfluid can sustain circulation. A superconducting loop can hold a current that seems almost suspended outside the everyday habits of matter. These are not small concessions. They are part of what makes the subject so interesting. The edge of impossibility is crowded with phenomena that look at first glance like exceptions. But in each case, the hidden cost of the dream is still there. The orbit depends on an initial dynamical arrangement, and remains useful only so long as you do not drain it as though it were a free machine. The superfluid depends on special quantum conditions, and does not become an endless engine merely because its internal flow is persistent. The superconductor preserves current, but preserving a state in a loop is not the same as endlessly powering external work without renewed input or broader thermodynamic expense. One might say that nature is generous with persistence and strict with productivity. She will sometimes let motion endure astonishingly well. She's much less willing to let that enduring motion behave like an infinite source of practical output. That difference is everything. It is the difference between watching a near lossless state and extracting a permanent free lunch from it. These examples also teach a more subtle lesson about what counts as a source. A persistent current is not a source in the way a battery is a source. A circulating superfluid is not a source in the way a pump connected to a pressure gradient is a source. An orbit is not a source in the way burning fuel is a source. They are states of systems holding energy or structure in unusually durable ways. Confuse a durable state with a self-renewing source, and you step straight back into the old mistake that has been haunting this story from the beginning. Still, there is one more reason people keep glancing toward these edge cases, and it is not entirely misguided. Once quantum physics enters the scene, the world begins behaving in ways that are strange enough to make almost any old certainty feel slightly less comfortable. Particles tunnel. Vacuums are not simple emptiness. Fields fluctuate. Ground states have structure. Zero temperature itself becomes a complicated ideal rather than a simple blankness. With all of that strangeness in view, it is natural for the imagination to ask whether somewhere in the quantum world there might be a genuine loophole after all. Some subtle way in which the ordinary thermodynamic refusals are softened, bypassed, or outwitted. That question deserves careful treatment precisely because it is the most sophisticated descendant of the old dream. By the time we get there, we're no longer dealing with a village wheelwright staring at weighted arms and hoping gravity will be more generous than expected. We're dealing with vacuum energy, ground states, quantum fluctuations, and the idea that perhaps the universe hides a reserve in places classical intuition never thought to search. And this is where the story becomes especially delicate, because quantum physics really does allow phenomena that sound, at first hearing, like loopholes. The trouble is that sounding like a loophole and being one are not the same thing, which is why the next step has to be taken very carefully. By the time the discussion reaches quantum physics, the old dream acquires a fresh set of clothes and begins speaking in a much more confident voice. It no longer arrives as a wheel with badly behaved weights or a sketch of magnets arranged around a hopeful rotor. It arrives with words like vacuum, fluctuation, zero-point motion, tunneling, coherence, and ground state. It arrives with the general advantage that quantum mechanics already sounds strange to most people, which means a claim can borrow some legitimacy simply by standing near genuinely strange things and looking pleased with itself. This is why the quantum version of the perpetual motion dream is so persistent. Quantum physics really does overturn many ordinary intuitions. Particles are not tiny billiard balls in the naive sense. Empty space is not quite empty in the simple everyday sense. Systems can possess energy even in their lowest allowed states. Matter can behave collectively in ways that seem almost engineered by mischief. If one were looking for a loophole in the old laws, this is exactly where one would go. The classical routes have all been blocked. Gravity will not save the wheel. Magnets will not rescue the rotor. Heat refuses to come back obediently. So the imagination goes smaller, deeper, stranger, into the places where reality already behaves in ways that make common sense look slightly underdressed. And yet the verdict remains unchanged. Quantum physics does not reopen the case for perpetual motion. What it does instead is teach us a more refined version of why the loophole is not really a loophole. The confusion usually begins with one of a few recurring ideas. The first is that quantum systems possess restless motion or residual energy even in their lowest states, and therefore perhaps there is always something left to extract. The second is that the vacuum itself contains fluctuations, and therefore perhaps empty space is a hidden reservoir waiting to be tapped. The third is that quantum randomness might be rectified into a one-way flow of useful work without paying the usual costs. The fourth is that information, measurement, or clever feedback might somehow let us cheat the old thermodynamic rules. Each of these ideas sounds intelligent at first. Each of them also turns out to fail in a very instructive way. Let us begin with the ground state, because it is often the first source of hope. In classical imagination, the lowest energy state of a system sounds like perfect stillness. A ball sits at the bottom of a bowl, and that is that. Quantum mechanics complicates this picture. Even in the lowest allowed state, a system may still possess what is sometimes called zero-point motion, or zero-point energy. the system cannot in general have both perfectly defined position and perfectly defined motion in the way classical pictures tempt us to expect. As a result, the lowest state is not just a dull, empty stillness. There is a kind of irreducible quantum activity to it. Now, to a hopeful mind, this sounds immediately promising. If there is energy even in the lowest state, then perhaps that energy can be harvested. Perhaps matter is never truly at rest because nature always leaves a little on the table, and perhaps that little can be turned into endless useful output. This is exactly the sort of thought that keeps the old dream alive under new management. But the crucial word in the phrase lowest state is lowest. If a system is already in its ground state, then there is no lower allowed state for it to fall into while giving up useful work in the ordinary sense. The residual energy is not a convenient spare coin left under the sofa cushion of reality. It is part of what defines the baseline state itself. A simple way to see the problem is to compare it with altitude. Suppose a ball is resting at the bottom of a valley. You may say the ball still has mass, still has internal structure, still participates in the world in all sorts of ways. All true. But none of that means there is still downhill gravitational energy available from that particular position. The ball is already at the bottom relative to that valley. The quantum ground state is similar in the relevant respect. The state may not look classically motionless, but it is still the lowest available state. You do not get useful work out by demanding that it fall below the bottom. This distinction becomes especially important when people talk about vacuum energy. Quantum field theory gives a picture of the vacuum that is not mere nothingness. Fields have ground state structure. There are fluctuations. There are measurable effects, some of them very subtle and very real. The existence of such effects tempts people into a familiar leap. If the vacuum is not empty, then perhaps it contains unlimited energy that can be extracted forever. One sometimes hears this spoken as though the universe were a badly supervised warehouse, and quantum physics had accidentally left the back door open. The trouble is that the vacuum, insofar as it is the ground state of the relevant fields, is again not a readily drainable reservoir in the naive sense. The fact that the vacuum has structure does not mean one can connect a wire to empty space and begin charging household devices. A ground state is not a fuel tank simply because it is not featureless. The energy associated with it is part of the baseline. To extract usable work cyclically, one would need a lower state to descend into or some maintained difference to exploit. The old conditions return in new language. Useful work still depends on gradients, differences, non-equilibrium structure, or externally created arrangements. Merely shouting vacuum at the problem does not create a loophole. A famous example that often confuses people is the effect associated with closely spaced conducting plates in vacuum. Under the right conditions, measurable forces can arise because the presence of boundaries changes the allowed quantum modes of the fields between and around them. This is a real and fascinating phenomenon, and it often gets recruited into stories about free energy from the vacuum. The hopeful version runs something like this. If the plates are pulled together by a quantum effect, then the vacuum is doing work and perhaps a clever machine can repeat the process forever. But once more, the cycle defeats the fantasy. If the plates move together and you extract work during that motion, you must then separate them again to restore the initial arrangement. That separation costs at least what you gained, with practical losses added if reality has been invited into the room. The effect is real. The loophole is not. What looked like a free gift turns out to be another case of drawing work from a difference in configuration and then needing to repay the cost of resetting the configuration. The quantum world, for all its novelty, remains suspiciously loyal to bookkeeping. Randomness offers another tempting path. Quantum mechanics includes genuinely probabilistic aspects in standard interpretations, which leads some people to imagine that randomness itself might be a source. If events occur unpredictably, perhaps one can design a system that catches only the favourable fluctuations and ignores the unfavourable ones, gradually accumulating useful work out of microscopic chance. This is the quantum descendant of several older dreams, including various ratchets and one-way devices imagined to rectify thermal motion. The hope is always the same. Since matter at small scales is restless, perhaps clever asymmetry can turn that restless motion into a steady, useful output without any wider cost. The problem is that equilibrium systems are not so easy to bully. A ratchet that is supposed to allow motion one way and forbid it the other is itself part of the system. If it can fluctuate, it will. If it is at the same temperature as the rest, it does not politely sit there enforcing your preferred direction while exempting itself from thermal agitation. Quantum versions of this story do not change the conclusion. Detailed balance, fluctuation relations, and the full accounting of system plus apparatus prevent the free one-way harvesting of equilibrium randomness into perpetual useful work. Any device subtle enough to exploit the fluctuations must itself obey the same microscopic rules. This is where Maxwell Demon likes to reappear, usually wearing a very pleased expression. The demon is the famous thought experiment involving a hypothetical being that sorts faster and slower molecules without spending work in the obvious mechanical sense, apparently creating a useful temperature difference from equilibrium and thus threatening the second law. It is one of the great stories in the history of thermodynamics, precisely because it looks like such a clever loophole. And once quantum mechanics enters the picture, the demon seems even more interesting. Perhaps measurement, information, and feedback at the microscopic level can achieve what ordinary engines cannot. But the modern understanding of the demon does not rescue perpetual motion. It clarifies why information is not free. To measure, store, erase, and act on information in a cyclically repeatable way carries thermodynamic consequences. The demon cannot merely observe without physical embodiment and cost. Once the full loop is analysed, including memory and reset, the apparent violation disappears. This is one of the most beautiful examples of how physics closes its own loopholes. The demon was not dismissed because it was silly. It was examined until the missing cost became visible. The lesson is not that information is irrelevant, but that it too lives inside the laws rather than outside them. Quantum coherence also encourages misunderstanding. Coherence is real and important. Quantum systems can maintain phase relationships and collective structure in ways that allow extraordinary effects. This lies behind a great deal of modern physics and technology. It is part of why superconductors and certain other quantum states behave so differently from ordinary matter. Yet coherence is not a thermodynamic pardon. It can help preserve special states. It can reduce certain kinds of dissipation. It can make processes more delicate, more ordered, and more impressive. What it does not do is generate endless useful work from a closed system with no restoring source. In fact, coherence is often fragile. Maintaining it requires isolation, low noise, careful preparation, or active control. Decoherence, the tendency for a quantum system to lose its delicate phase relationships through interaction with the environment, is one of the most familiar ways the wider world reasserts itself. So even in the places where quantum behavior seems most disciplined, the general story remains recognizable. Special structure can exist. Preserving it is hard. Using it in a cycle means paying broader costs somewhere. The dream of free, self-renewing output continues to run into the same wall, only now the wall is decorated with more sophisticated vocabulary. Sometimes the loophole is phrased in terms of tunneling. Since quantum particles can cross barriers they would classically be unable to cross, perhaps one can build a machine in which particles continually tunnel one way and produce a steady net output, but tunneling is not a magical directional preference built into the world for your convenience. It occurs within specific potential landscapes and occupation conditions. If a process is allowed one way, the reverse possibilities and the surrounding thermodynamic context must be considered too. One cannot simply point at a classically forbidden transition, becoming allowed, and conclude that the second law has developed a soft spot. A related confusion comes from non-equilibrium quantum systems. There are indeed quantum engines, quantum refrigerators, driven quantum devices, and many other systems in which quantum effects influence performance in interesting ways. Research in this area is rich and active. But these are not perpetual motion machines. They are engines and devices operating under carefully defined sources, sinks, couplings, driving protocols, and environmental conditions. They obey thermodynamics, even when quantum features modify how efficiency, work extraction, or fluctuations are best described. The quantum label does not erase the need for a hot and cold bath, an external drive, or some other maintained asymmetry. It simply makes the analysis more interesting. This is a broader point worth dwelling on. Quantum mechanics does not repeal thermodynamics. It deepens it. It tells us more about what matter is doing at small scales, how states can be prepared, how measurements behave, how fluctuations arise, and how collective phenomena emerge. All of that enriches the thermodynamic picture. It does not reopen the possibility of a closed machine that powers itself forever while returning endlessly to its original capacity. If anything, quantum theory gives us more ways to see why the loophole is not real, because it forces us to analyze apparatus, memory, environment, and state preparation more carefully than loose classical imagination sometimes did. There is also a practical reason quantum free energy claims are so seductive. Very few people can check them comfortably. If someone shows you a weighted wheel, you may at least suspect where to start looking. If someone begins discussing vacuum fluctuations, squeeze states, boundary conditions, and coherent extraction protocols, many listeners will feel an understandable hesitation. Perhaps they think this is beyond ordinary skepticism. Perhaps the claim survives not because it is sound, but because it has become difficult to argue with over dinner. Complexity can shelter bad ideas in the same way that polished brass once did. Still, genuine quantum effects are too interesting to treat carelessly. The right response is neither gullibility nor reflexive dismissal. It is careful accounting. What is the system? What is the state? How is it prepared? What counts as the source? What is being reset each cycle? Where is the entropy going? What environmental gradient or external drive is really being used? Does the device produce a transient output from stored non-equilibrium structure, or a sustained one from an actual continuing source? These questions are not attempts to kill wonder. They are the tools that separate wonder from confusion. A useful example is a battery. A battery can certainly deliver useful work, and in some cases quantum mechanics is part of the deeper story of the materials involved. But nobody mistakes a battery for perpetual motion once its chemistry is understood. The battery works because it starts in a non-equilibrium state. There is free energy stored in chemical differences. When those differences flatten, the battery is spent. The same logic applies in more sophisticated form to many quantum systems that look exotic. They may contain useful order, coherence, or population imbalance when prepared. That does not mean they are loopholes. It means they are resources, and resources run down unless replenished. This is the right lens for the quantum edge cases. They are not breaches in the wall. They are unusual resources and unusual states whose behavior can be extremely different from ordinary intuition. Some can store energy or order in striking ways. Some can suppress familiar losses. Some can make engines and sensors better. Some can challenge our sense of what counts as empty, still, or simple. But none of them becomes an endlessly self-renewing source merely by being strange. Strangeness is not the same as a loophole, and perhaps that is the deepest lesson the quantum story adds. Nature is under no obligation to be familiar in order to remain lawful. She can be very strange and still refuse perpetual motion. She can allow vacuum fluctuations, ground state structure, tunneling, coherence, superconductivity, superfluidity, entanglement, and all the other marvels of modern physics without ever granting the one thing the old dream really wants, which is a permanently free source of useful output from a closed cycle. The laws do not defend themselves by being dull. They defend themselves by being consistent even in the strangest places. So the quantum loophole is not really a loophole. It is a mirror held up to our expectations. We hear that empty space is not empty, that the lowest state still has activity, that microscopic events fluctuate, and we immediately imagine a hidden reserve waiting to be harvested. What physics teaches instead is subtler. Baselines are not fuel tanks. Fluctuations are not free gradients. Information is not thermodynamically innocent. Special states are resources, not miracles. And every cyclic machine, no matter how modern its vocabulary, still has to face the same old questions about source, reset, and total accounting. Once that is clear, the dream has nowhere left to retreat except into the human side of the story. If the weighted wheels fail, the magnetic rotors fail, the perfect classical machine fails, the thermal loophole fails, and even the quantum version fails, then why does the idea still grip us? Why do people keep drawing, building, announcing, hoping and returning to the impossible machine as though the universe might eventually soften if asked with enough sincerity? That final question is not really about mechanics at all. It is about us, and about why the most durable impossible machine may have been the dream itself. By the time we reach this point, the impossible machine has been denied in almost every language physics knows how to speak. It has been denied by conservation. It has been denied by heat. It has been denied by entropy. It has been denied by careful engineering, by idealized reasoning, by statistical thinking, and by the strange refinements of quantum theory. It has been denied in the workshop, denied in the laboratory, denied in the heavens, denied in the coldest corners of matter, and denied again in the abstract language of theory. And yet the dream remains. People still imagine the wheel that turns forever, the engine that feeds itself, the device that gives without taking. They still draw it, fund it, whisper about it, defend it, and occasionally wheel it into public view with the familiar expression of someone who believes history is about to become awkward for everyone else. That persistence is worth taking seriously, because it tells us something important. The dream of perpetual motion survives, not because the physics is unclear, but because the desire behind it is older and deeper than the physics that answers it. The impossible machine is not just a technical mistake. It is a human wish. It is the wish that nature might contain a hidden kindness, a loophole in effort, a route around cost, a bargain buried beneath appearances. It is the hope that somewhere in the structure of things there exists a gentle cheat, a way to keep receiving without finally having to give back. That hope takes many forms. Sometimes it is practical. Life is full of things that run down. Bodies get tired, lamps go out, batteries empty, food spoils, fuel burns, heat leaks, time passes, maintenance accumulates. Real life, if we are being honest, is a long conversation with limits. So the idea of a machine that escapes all that speaks directly to a very ordinary hunger. It promises relief. It promises the end of topping up, refueling, rewinding, patching, cleaning, replacing, apologizing to the appliance, and pretending not to hear the sound that means a larger bill is coming. In that sense, the impossible machine is the most ambitious household fantasy ever designed. It is the dream of being sparedware. Sometimes the wish is economic. A self-powering machine would not merely be convenient. It would overturn scarcity. It would transform industry, transport, infrastructure, daily life, and power itself. It would be difficult to exaggerate what such a breakthrough would mean if it were real. Whole systems of extraction, generation, distribution, and storage would be reorganized around it. The inventor would become one of the most consequential figures in history within the week. That possibility exerts a tremendous emotional pull. It is one thing to design a better engine. It is another to imagine becoming the person who made fuel optional. Even people who distrust the dream intellectually can feel its gravitational force at the level of ambition. There is also the appeal of cleverness. Perpetual motion flatters a particular image of intelligence. It suggests that most people are trapped by convention, while the truly insightful person sees the hidden asymmetry, the overlooked timing, the configuration everyone else dismissed too quickly. This is a very powerful story because it lets the dreamer occupy a highly rewarding role. They are not merely building a machine, they are outthinking the world, they are rescuing truth from experts, simplicity from textbooks, possibility from habit. The machine becomes more than a mechanism. It becomes a moral drama in which bold insight confronts stodgy orthodoxy. And that drama is hard to resist, because real science does sometimes advance through challenges to accepted belief. Established views are not sacred. Genuine revolutions do happen. New theories do replace old ones. Hidden effects are discovered. Measurements embarrass certainty. Progress can look, from a distance, very much like someone insisting that the impossible is merely unpopular. That similarity gives false hope a durable costume. The person defending an impossible machine can always cast themselves as the next unfairly mocked pioneer. History provides just enough examples of once doubted breakthroughs to make this story emotionally plausible even when the actual claim is unsound. This is one reason the impossible machine so often attaches itself to periods of rapid change. Whenever science and technology are moving quickly, the background noise of genuine progress makes extraordinary claims harder for non-specialists to sort. If engines are improving, electricity is spreading, materials are advancing, computation is exploding, and physics itself has recently been overturned by relativity or quantum mechanics, then why should one more impossibility not quietly become possible? The age feels permissive, the horizon feels unstable. It becomes easier to believe that the old prohibitions were merely temporary paperwork. There is something else as well, and it may be the most sympathetic reason of all. The impossible machine is appealing because the universe often looks more generous than it is. Motion is everywhere. Rivers run, winds blow, planets turn, stars shine, tides rise, fire burns, currents flow. Things move with such abundance that the world can seem rich in action beyond measure. It is natural to wonder whether all that movement hides a simpler secret. Why should nature not contain one clean mechanism that keeps going because the universe itself seems so full of ongoing activity? The misunderstanding here is deep but understandable. We see the abundance of processes and forget the gradients, sources, histories, and wider accounts that sustain them. The world is dynamic, but not free in the way the dream requires. The dream also survives because local intuition is so persuasive. A wheel does look heavier on one side, a magnet does pull without visible contact, a falling weight does feel like falling weight does feel like a gift from gravity. A fluid does rise, a current does persist, a planet does keep going. At each stage, the eye is offered something real and almost sufficient. The mistake is never entirely nonsense. It is usually a genuine phenomenon overextended into a fantasy. That is why the dream has such long legs. It keeps borrowing credibility from real effects. The weighted wheel borrows from leverage. The magnetic motor borrows from attraction. The thermal loophole borrows from the richness of heat. The quantum version borrows from genuine strangeness. Every generation gets to renew the old hope with newer examples, and then there is the emotional comfort of hidden abundance. To accept the impossibility of perpetual motion is, at some quiet level, to accept that the universe is not organized around our convenience. It means there is no permanent exemption from cost built into the laws. There is no endlessly forgiving machine waiting to be noticed. Usefulness must be maintained. Differences must be paid for. Order can be created locally but not without consequence elsewhere. For some temperaments this is not merely disappointing, it feels aesthetically offensive. Surely such a rich and intricate universe ought to contain one secret act of generosity. Surely everything cannot be so exacting. But perhaps the exacting nature of reality is part of what gives the subject its strange emotional power. The impossible machine is a rebellion against limits in their purest form. It says no to depletion, no to maintenance, no to imbalance. No to the slow wearing away that seems built into so much of existence. In that sense, it is almost philosophical before it is mechanical. It expresses the ancient human dislike of finitude. We do not enjoy things that run down, whether they are clocks, batteries, bodies, civilizations, or afternoons. We want continuity without decay. The wheel that never stops is only the most literal version of that longing. This is why the subject often becomes surprisingly personal. A person may begin by discussing bearings, fields, or gradients, and end up defending something more like a worldview. The machine becomes symbolic. If it works, then the world is more open than the experts claim. If it works, then hidden simplicity defeats institutional caution. If it works, then scarcity is not as final as it seemed. If it works, then one can refuse the dull arithmetic of limits and be vindicated by nature herself. Very few technical proposals carry that much emotional weight, which is why debates about perpetual motion can feel more intense than the diagrams alone would justify. Yet there is another side to this story, and it is a kinder one. The impossible machine has not only misled people, it has also taught them. Wrong ideas are not always sterile ideas. Sometimes a dream is so persistent, so seductive, and so difficult to kill properly that it forces science to deepen itself in response. Perpetual motion did that. It pushed people to clarify conservation, to sharpen the idea of work, to understand heat more honestly, to distinguish amount from usefulness, and to formulate laws broad enough to explain why so many ingenious designs kept failing in different costumes. The dream was wrong, but productively wrong. It forced better questions. This is something I rather like about the history of science. The path to understanding is not paved only with correct first thoughts. Often it is the durable mistake that matters most, the mistake alluring enough to survive long enough that reality has to answer it in public. Perpetual motion belongs to that family. It is not merely a foolish detour. It is one of the great training grounds in scientific humility. It teaches that intuition is local, that cycles matter, that sources hide in plain sight, that usefulness is not the same thing as energy, and that the world can preserve mystery while denying magic. And perhaps that is why the dream never fully disappears, even among people who know perfectly well that it cannot be realized. There remains something lovable about the impossible machine. It is elegant. It is economical. It is ambitious in a childlike and grand way. It asks too much of the universe, but it asks with style. One can admire the shape of the wish even while rejecting the mechanism. One can understand why a person confronted with rivers, magnets, stars, steam, and silence in a workshop might feel that somewhere among these things a secret had been left unclaimed. There is also a lesson in how close nature sometimes comes to encouraging that suspicion. Orbits last. Superconducting currents persist. Superfluids circulate. Low-loss resonators ring on and on. Certain systems maintain order with an eerie calm that makes ordinary experience look clumsy by comparison. Nature is not dull. She allows astonishing persistence when the conditions are right. This matters because it means the dream is not born from complete fantasy. It is born from noticing correctly that the world can preserve motion far better than daily life suggests. The error lies in turning persistence into a source and durability into free productivity. Once that distinction settles in, the impossible machine becomes a mirror rather than a proposal. It reflects what we most want from the world. Endless motion, yes, but also endless givenness. It reflects our discomfort with waste, our impatience with maintenance, our admiration for clever asymmetry, our love of hidden simplicity, our tendency to confuse local opportunity with global accounting, and our stubborn hope that the universe may still owe us one great surprise. In that sense, the machine is impossible, but the dream is perfectly natural. There is no shame in that. In fact, I suspect it would be stranger if the dream did not recur. A species that builds tools, watches the sky, notices patterns and dislikes effort was always going to imagine a machine that escapes replenishment, It was always going to suspect that somewhere in the turning of things there might be a loophole. The real achievement is not that we had the dream. The real achievement is that we eventually learned how to answer it without losing our sense of wonder. Because wonder is the important thing here. The impossibility of perpetual motion is not a bleak conclusion, unless one insists that reality is only interesting when it behaves like a fantasy. The real universe is, if anything, more impressive. It allows stars to shine for ages without cheating. It allows life to build islands of order in a broader sea of entropy. It allows matter to enter strange collective states where currents persist and fluids flow with uncanny grace. It allows engines, grids, reactors, computers, telescopes, and all the vast practical triumphs of civilization, not by suspending the laws, but by making those laws rich enough to work with. A lawful universe is not a poor one. It is the only kind that could become intelligible, and that may be the most satisfying answer to the old dream. We still dream of the impossible machine because we are drawn to abundance without cost. But what we discovered instead is something subtler and, in its own way, more beautiful. The universe does not offer endless free output. What it offers is structure, gradients, history, and the possibility of learning how to use them well. It offers real power where differences exist. It offers long persistence when losses are suppressed. It offers order that can be maintained locally through wider exchange. It offers almost supernatural efficiency in the hands of good engineering. It offers laws strict enough to disappoint fantasy and generous enough to permit stars, cells, storms, and symphonies of machinery all the same. So perhaps the impossible machine remains with us because it marks the boundary between two kinds of imagination. On one side is the wish for a shortcut, a gift, a machine that frees us from accounting. On the other side is the harder and better imagination that asks how far honest understanding can go within the limits that are real. Science, at its best, belongs to the second kind. It does not merely say no. It says here is what is actually possible, and here is why that is already remarkable. And with that, the dream does not quite vanish. It softens. It becomes less a claim and more a story we tell about our own relationship to limits. Somewhere there is still a person sketching a wheel late at night, convinced the textbooks missed a detail. Somewhere else there is a physicist rubbing tired eyes and preparing again to explain gradients and entropy with saintly patience. And between them sits the impossible machine itself, not turning, not producing, not quite going away either, still doing the one thing it has always done exceptionally well, which is to keep the human imagination in motion a little longer.